from Corsica to the 4th Rome. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 26, Touring West City. Oh my god, who are these people? Ajacsio's patrol? How long have they not been to the West City? Who knows? They have only been here a few times in the past 10 years. Is the leader Napoleon Bonaparte? He is so young. When Lawrence's team appeared on the road in the West City, they immediately became the focus of everyone's attention. Pedestrians on the street quickly retreated to both sides to make way, and at the same time, looked at this fully armed team timidly and curiously. Poor people came out of their simple shacks one after another, tiptoed on both sides of the street, wanting to see this rare scene. As for those who have committed crimes repeatedly, they all hid in the shadows of the street corners in panic, carefully looking out to observe. They have all heard of this Napoleon Bonaparte, who is said to look down on even members of the trade union. Lord Bonaparte, where should we start? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, to hunt down the one eye in this damn place. Old Scene covered his mouth and nose, and he hadn't recovered from the stench here for a while. He asked Lawrence in a vague voice. Lawrence nodded in agreement. The slums in front of him were all pitch black. Even Anna, who had lived here for more than 10 years, almost got lost last time. It was not easy to hunt down the one eye. What's more, Zeluo had done his best to rescue the one eye, so he would not hand him back easily. Maybe the one eye is hiding in the church at the Union headquarters. Fortunately, the main purpose of Lawrence's trip was to show up in the West City district, to show his determination to restore order. As for the one eye, although his escape from prison had a great impact on the reputation of the patrol team, Lawrence was helpless for a while. My lord, something is wrong. Suddenly, Jan walked behind Lawrence with an expressionless face and said softly. Lawrence tilted his head slightly, frowned and scanned the surroundings. It was a crowd of grey people watching the excitement. That bastard Zeluo, he won't give me a show of strength, just because I just arrived. Lawrence thought so, and asked in a deep voice, what did you find? Just now, 5 people in the crowd gathered together to discuss something, and then left quickly, very much like spies. Adam stared at the direction where those people left and reported. Lawrence looked at Adam with a little appreciation. It would be impossible to notice such anomalies in such a crowded crowd if he didn't keep a high level of concentration at all times. However, Jan's words really aroused Lawrence's vigilance. Although it is a common practice for various gangs to deploy spies and spies in the city, deploying 5 people in one area at a time is a bit unusual. It's like he was waiting for his group on purpose. It seems that the bastard Zeluo Russell has a gift for meeting. Lawrence thought, but did not slow down the pace of the team. The group had just arrived in the West City district and had not walked a few steps. If they returned the same way, because they were afraid of Zeluo's calculations, I'm afraid that the people of the West City district would label Lawrence as a showman from then on. After a whole morning of cruising, Lawrence almost went around the slum area. Although as expected, no trace of the one-eyed man was found, but this patrol did have the effect of deterring lawbreakers. Those criminals were very cautious and ominous before they figured out the intention of Lord Bonaparte to come to the West City district. Among the pedestrians on the street, it was difficult to find the bullies who usually harmed the area here. However, Lawrence understood that, if he wanted to truly rebuild order here, he had to send people to stay here permanently. Today's patrol would not work for too long. Another thing that made Lawrence alert was that during the patrol throughout the morning, everything went surprisingly smoothly without any obstruction or conflict from anyone. Lawrence didn't believe that Ciro would let him wander around his territory with great fanfare. If he still wanted to attack him, the only chance left was Lord Bonaparte. The slums have been inspected, and the only thing left is the dock area. Old Scene reminded hesitantly. If possible, he didn't want to step into there. Lawrence also narrowed his eyes. If Ciro really had any tricks, he would probably do it in the dock area. It was the most chaotic and complicated area in Ajaccio and even in Corsica. Various forces were intertwined. The dock gangs, the poor in the West City, foreign merchants, the captains and sailors who docked, and even the Corsican navy and Governor Paola's faction. They were attracted to this prosperous port and divided up every bit of profit. Especially after the Genoese reached an agreement with the French to sell Corsica, the Genoese navy's trade blockade of Corsica was greatly reduced, which made the port city of Ajaccio more and more revitalized, and the port's pie became bigger and bigger. The White Rose that Lawrence was on at the time was really unlucky, and it ran into a Genoese warship right in the face. If the two sides were far enough apart, the Genoese warship might have turned a blind eye. Noon was the busiest time in the port. 20 or so flat-bottomed fishing boats that had been out to sea since early morning were returning slowly with full loads. A double-decker paddle sail merchant ship loaded the cargo, raised the sails and set sail. At the farthest point of the view, where the sea and the sky meet, you can vaguely see several merchant ships heading towards Ajaccio. Read the correct version in 16:9 book bar. At the northernmost end of the port, the two docks with the deepest draft were reserved for the only two-line warships of the Corsican navy. Lawrence estimated that they should be of the same specifications as the Genoese warships that day. The dock was always filled with constant chatter, whether it was the insults of the sailors who were full of rum or the shouts of the dock workers. They were the unchanging theme here. Although it seemed noisy here, Lawrence found after observing for a while that everything on the dock was running in an orderly manner. There was no blood and corpses left by the fire and fight as he imagined. It seems that Cyril Russell really put a lot of thought into tidying up here. Lawrence made a judgment secretly, thinking of the description of Cyril by the one-eyed man when he interrogated him that day. Since he thought of Cyril, Lawrence couldn't help but be cautious. He looked around and guarded against the venom of this venomous snake from the shadows somewhere. Jan, who always followed Lawrence, was highly focused, and his sharp eyes swept through every corner around him. Suddenly, Jan's pupils shrank, and his eyes focused on a big man with a linen hood covering his face not far away. Although his face was covered, Jan would never forget this figure. "Sir, that's One Eye." "What?" Both Lawrence and the other guards of the patrol were shocked and looked in the direction Jan pointed. How could One Eye, who had finally escaped from prison, appear in front of the patrol? Exclamation mark. Although the face under the hood could not be seen clearly, with such a strong figure, it was almost impossible to make a mistake. The big man noticed the gazes of Lawrence and the guards, grinned, and said to himself, "Finally he's here, making me wait for so long." Then One Eye pulled off his hood directly, revealing his iconic black eye mask without any cover. No one knew why he dared to appear here openly. Thanks to the recommendation vote of Chris Lynn Bookfriend. Thank you for your support. Chapter 27 Fierce Battle. Oh my god. It's One Eye, the leader of the Sea Snake gang. Didn't he just escape from prison? The group of people opposite him are patrolmen. Could it be that Lawrence Bonaparte has tracked down One Eye? As expected of Lawrence Bonaparte, he found One Eye in just one day. The dock workers passing by immediately recognized One Eye's identity and started to talk to each other in twas and threes. One Eye spat on the ground and said arrogantly, "Captain Bonaparte, I didn't expect you to find me so quickly." Lawrence looked around in confusion, wanting to say that he had bumped into me by himself, but he realized that it was another good show directed by that bastard Zero. "Everyone listen up, load and prepare to shoot." Lawrence ordered his subordinates in a deep voice, and he also took out his pistol and started to load gunpowder, and said calmly to the one-eyed man, "If you stay in jail, I can still keep your life as agreed." Humph! The one-eyed man snorted disdainfully, and the flesh on his face piled up together, and said coldly, "When we first met, I said I would chop you into a human stick and throw you into the sea. Lawrence Bonaparte, this sea is your burial place. Brothers, follow me." The one-eyed man shouted, and dozens of Sea Snake gang members rushed out of a wooden house behind him. At the same time, dozens of dock workers around him took off their shirts, revealing the Sea Snake tattoos inside. Lawrence's pupils trembled, and his eyeballs moved rapidly, quickly scanning these gang members, and roughly estimated that there were at least 100 of them, which were definitely all the members of the Sea Snake gang. Old Scene's legs trembled when he saw this. Although the patrolmen were holding muskets at such a close distance, they would be forced into hand-to-hand combat after a round of volleys. In a hand-to-hand fight, facing an enemy 5 times their own number, it can only be said that there is no chance of winning. Forget it. Lawrence gritted his teeth and admitted that he underestimated Zluo's methods. He thought that Zluo would only use some tricks to make things difficult for him like before, but he didn't expect that he would suddenly insert a fatal attack in the midst of small fights. He obviously wanted to use the one-eyed man to directly wipe him out. Even if the one-eyed man was rearrested afterwards, as long as the one-eyed man insisted on the personal grudge between him and Lawrence, no one would suspect that it was Zluo who was behind it. Even if someone suspected it, they could not produce any evidence. Zluo Russell, I will personally send you to hell one day. Lawrence growled, then his eyes condensed, raised his head, and pointed the gun at the one-eyed man, and pulled the trigger without any hesitation. One Eye was no pushover either, with a very developed fighting instinct. The moment Lawrence raised his gun, he leaped to the left, and hid behind a few wooden boxes. Everyone, listen up. Fire freely. Lawrence shouted, while putting his pistol back into his waist. The distance between the two sides would not allow them to reload for the second round. One Eye hid behind the cover and shouted, brothers, charge. The sound of the patrol's muskets blasted, and the shouts of the gang members charging. After a round of volleys, only a dozen gang members were shot and fell. The remaining more than 80 people trampled on the fallen ones, and continued to rush towards the patrol with machetes. Lawrence gritted his teeth, pulled out his short knife, and continued to order, everyone, use your bayonets. Keep your formation in order. The length of the musket with a bayonet can reach about 1.4 meters. Compared with the machetes in the hands of the gang members, which are slightly longer than kitchen knives, it can be regarded as a long pole weapon. If they can maintain a two-row formation of long guns and take care of each other, they can resist for a longer period of time. The 20 people who were selected to accompany Lawrence today are also the elite of the team. They did not disintegrate and flee in the face of an enemy that far outnumbered them. A gang member who was charging at the front roared and rushed up, raising his machete, and was about to chop it down. A patrolman in the front row was quick-witted, and stabbed his bayonet forward, piercing the throat of the gang member. While he was retracting his bayonet, another gang member found the right opportunity, and rushed up to chop him with a knife. At this moment, the patrolman in the back row stabbed with a knife, accurately piercing the heart of the gang member who attacked by surprise. Such resistance only lasted for a short time. Even though a river of enemy blood had already flowed under the patrolmen, the enemy was too numerous and powerful. As more and more patrolmen were injured, the formation could no longer be maintained. Damn it. Lawrence cursed, swinging his sword to block the hacking of the gang in front of him. Although the physical fitness of this body was much better than that of Lawrence in his previous life, the lack of combat experience still made it difficult for him to parry. Sir. Yan used his sword to pick up the machete of the gang in front of him, mercilessly pierced through the heart with a sword, and then hurriedly pulled himself out to rescue Lawrence. Old Scene was short in stature and was nearly 60 years old. He had to rely on his experience to dodge the swords and shadows quickly. After a while, he retreated to Lawrence's side panting. Sir Bonaparte, run. Old Scene said, holding his chest and breathing heavily. Yan nodded heavily, waved his sword to repel the two gang members who came forward to attack, and said to Lawrence, I will cover you, sir, you go quickly. A correct version in the 16:9 book forum. Lawrence gritted his teeth. He had already faced death on the White Rose, and was not panicked at this moment. If it were not for the last moment, he would never lose the elite patrol team here. After the first round of volleys from the patrol soldiers, the one-eyed man also came out of the bunker, watching his men drown Lawrence and his party with a cold and playful look. Although he might have to live in anonymity for the rest of his life after doing this, the one-eyed man still felt quite happy when he thought of the humiliation he suffered at the hands of Lawrence. Lawrence Bonaparte, if you put down your weapons and beg for mercy now, I can still keep your body. The one-eyed man shouted arrogantly at the patrol soldiers who were still struggling. Under the protection of Yan, Lawrence quickly analyzed the current situation. If he retreated by force, except for himself and the Old Scene who could not fight, everyone else would die on the spot. Such a loss was unacceptable to Lawrence. Moreover, Lawrence knew that, since One Eye dared to attack him openly, he would definitely not plan to appear in the public eye again in the future, and he would have no way to seek revenge later. Yan had 5 or 6 knife wounds on his body. Although they were not deep, they were still bleeding. He fought with two gang members who were rushing towards Lawrence with a sword and shouted to Lawrence, "My lord, go, Jan." Lawrence looked at Jan, who was covered in blood, bit his lips tightly, and moved his right foot back slightly. If he really reached the end of his rope, Lawrence would retreat without hesitation. Is there no chance of turning around? One Eye walked towards Lawrence with a hideous smile, and the fat on his face was almost completely squeezed together. At this time, a voice that surprised both One Eye and Lawrence was heard. "Lawrence Bonaparte? One Eye? Who the hell is that?" One Eye yelled and looked at the person who spoke. Lawrence also stood firm and looked at the person who shouted. This voice was not familiar, but it seemed that he had heard it somewhere before. Thanks to the book friend Fashion Bayruameng for the monthly ticket support. Thanks to the book friend Occasional Jianghu for the recommendation ticket. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28 Rescue. One Eye used his remaining right eye to look at the person who was shouting. He saw that he was a sturdy man, followed by a large number of subordinates, all of whom were fierce looking and strong. The man had a light blue sailor's turban on his head and was naked from the waist up. The most eye-catching thing was the narrow scar on his cheek. "Grosso? Grosso?" Lawrence and One Eye screamed at the same time and then looked at each other at the same time, as if they were both surprised why the other knew Grosso. This was Grosso, the sailor who saved Lawrence's life more than once on the White Rose that day. At that time, the shock wave generated by the explosion of the White Rose blew Lawrence and the sailors in the sea to pieces. After that, Lawrence never saw Grosso again. After being appointed as the deputy captain, Lawrence also asked his men to pay more attention to whether they saw a sailor with a narrow scar on his face, but there was no news of Grosso. After all, the patrol team's power was limited to the north and south urban areas of Ajaccio. Unexpectedly, the two of them would meet again in such a critical situation. Grosso narrowed his eyes. Having experienced hundreds of battles, he saw at a glance that Lawrence's side was already in a losing position. "Ha ha ha, Bonaparte boy." Grosso laughed heartily, pulled out the sailor knife on his waist, spun it in his hand, and danced a gorgeous knife flower, shouting, "I don't know how many times I have saved you. Brothers, go. I want to capture the one-eyed man alive." Although he didn't know why Grosso had a grudge with the one-eyed man, Lawrence was stunned for a moment, knowing that Grosso and his group were on his side, and then he immediately ordered, "Everyone retreat, remove the bayonet, load and prepare to shoot." The bayonet used by the patrol was an old-fashioned plug-in bayonet, which needed to be inserted into the barrel. If you want to reload and shoot, you have to remove the bayonet. Grosso's men rushed into the battlefield from the flank, instantly breaking up the sea snake's siege of the patrolmen, allowing the patrolmen to withdraw and begin to remove their bayonets and load gunpowder. Damn it. Lawrence took advantage of the time to retreat and took a quick look at the casualties of the patrolmen, and couldn't help but curse. After retreating to a safe area, Jan could no longer stand up. He knelt on one knee and inserted his sword into the gap between the wooden boards of the dock. He used the sword to support himself and didn't fall down. The 6 knife wounds on his body were still bleeding. The situation of the others was not much better. Everyone's chest was stained red with blood, whether it was their own or the enemy's. Several people were so seriously injured that they couldn't stand steadily after loading the ammunition and sat directly on the ground. Even Lawrence himself, when he was parrying the fierce slashing of several gang members, was left with several deep knife wounds on his arms, but fortunately, no arteries were injured. Fortunately, no one has died so far, but if these injuries are not treated in time, whether it is excess of blood loss or wound infection, it can easily take a person's life. Grosso, can your people handle it? Lawrence shouted at Grosso, who rushed into the crowd and killed everyone. As an experienced old sailor, Grosso in the center of the battlefield dodged the downward slash of the gang in front of him with a small flash, and then swung his knife horizontally and cut his opponent's throat. No problem. Taking advantage of this gap, Grosso turned his head and replied loudly to Lawrence. He also knew that Lawrence and his men urgently needed to treat their injuries. After getting a positive answer, Lawrence sat cross-legged and hurriedly ordered Old Scene, go to the nearest tavern and ask someone to bring a barrel of rum, not those damn watered wines, and as many clean gauze as you can get. Old Scene was the oldest and had the worst fighting quality, but because of this, he had been dodging and did not suffer any serious injuries in the fight just now. Except for him, the others were all wounded. Understood. Old Scene responded and then rushed forward to prepare what Lawrence wanted. Old Scene, who was useless in the battle, already felt guilty, and after receiving Lawrence's order, he ran all the way. The battle not far away was coming to an end after Grosso's troops joined. Lawrence saw a few familiar faces among his subordinates. They seemed to be the sailors on the White Rose at that time. They were all brave and good at fighting. Grosso, I will kill you. One Eye watched the gang he had run for half his life being destroyed by Grosso's massacre. His right eye suddenly turned red, and he drew out his machete and rushed towards Grosso angrily. Humph! Grosso saw the meat mountain of One Eye rushing towards him, snorted slightly, and was not panicked at all. He turned around to avoid One Eye's charge, and drew his machete backhand to chop at One Eye's neck. The reputation of the one-eyed man was earned through fighting in the sea of blood and corpses. He dodged Grosso's horizontal slash with a flick of his head. The two sides tested each other for several rounds in the flash of swords and sabers. Suddenly, the one-eyed man roared, holding the knife with both hands, and slashed down at Grosso with all his strength. Grosso's pupils shrank. The one-eyed man's full strength slash could probably directly cut a bowl-thick piece of wood in half, but he was too late to dodge, so he had to hold the back of the knife with his left hand and block it. With a crisp clang, the sailor knife in Grosso's hand broke into two pieces under the one-eyed man's slash. Although the broken blade removed most of the force of Grosso's attack, Grosso, who was without a weapon, had no power to fight back against the one-eyed man. The one-eyed man's eyes turned cold, and he seized the opportunity to move forward and slash twice more. When Grosso dodged left and right, the one-eyed man also seized the opportunity and kicked Grosso to the ground. Check out the correct version on 16:9 book bar. I'll pay for my brother's life with your life. One Eye said coldly, with the tip of his knife pointing at Grosso's forehead. Grosso's men noticed something was wrong, but they were too far away from Grosso to rescue him. In the blink of an eye, Lawrence shouted, "Get down, Grosso!" Between life and death, Grosso had no time to hesitate. He chose to believe Lawrence and fell flat on the ground with his legs. "Idiot, are you lying on the ground and letting me kill you?" One Eye curled his lips and was about to mock, but he had no chance. He only heard a burst of gunfire in his ears, followed by unbearable pain all over his body. In the distance, white smoke rose in front of Lawrence's patrolmen. One Eye was shot all over his body in this volley of fire and fell to the ground and spit out blood. Fortunately, Grosso, who was lying flat on the ground, was not hit by stray bullets. That was a close call. Lawrence wiped the sweat from his forehead, somewhat thankful that he had ordered the patrolmen to remove their bayonets and load ammunition in advance. Phew, that was a close call. Grosso got up from the ground, gasping for breath. Although he had faced death countless times, every time he brushed shoulders with death, Grosso would still break out in a cold sweat. You can't kill me." The one-eyed man lying on the ground watched Grosso pick up his knife and walk towards him, spitting out blood and shouting incoherently. Thanks to Chrislin and Fu Shengbei Ru Meng for their recommendation votes. Chapter 29 Recruitment. "You can't, kill me." The one-eyed man screamed and coughed violently. Every time his throat twitched, a mouthful of blood came out. Grosso picked up the one-eyed man's machete and pointed at his forehead, as if the roles had just been reversed. He asked disdainfully, "Why can't I kill you? Cicero, I won't let you go." The one-eyed man struggled to raise his hand and pointed at Grosso's nose. "Humph, it's this Zluo again." Grosso spat directly on the one-eyed man's face and said, "I heard the name of this Zluo on the first day I arrived at the dock. I haven't even seen him until now. How could I be afraid of his revenge?" After hearing this, the one-eyed man laughed loudly, and his laughter was mixed with violent coughs, which was very tragic. "I have seen too many people who look down on Zluo. You are one. That Lawrence is also one. Both of you will die like those people, even more miserably than me." These few words seemed to have used up all the strength of the one-eyed man. When the last word came out of his mouth, the one-eyed man swung his head to the right, looked at Lawrence with complicated eyes, and then completely lost his vitality. With the death of the one-eyed man, the members of the Sea Snake gang completely gave up resistance. The remaining dozen people threw down their machetes, knelt on the ground, and begged for mercy loudly. Grosso kicked the one-eyed corpse with disdain, and then shouted, "Brothers, tie up the living ones and throw the dead ones into the sea. The loot you find belongs to you." At this time, Old Scene also took what Lawrence needed. He held a large piece of snow-white gauze in his hand, followed by 2 waiters from the tavern, and worked together to carry a large barrel of strong rum. "As for the money, I will send someone to the tavern tomorrow." Lawrence glanced at the 2 waiters and said. The 2 men put down the heavy barrel with difficulty, and one of them nodded repeatedly and said, "Of course, no problem, we trust Mr. Bonaparte's name." Then, the 2 carefully looked at the dock covered with blood and various bile, and hurriedly trotted away. Lawrence scooped a handful of blood from the barrel with his right hand, and then sprinkled it directly on the injured part. The needle-like pain from the wound made Lawrence couldn't help but take a breath, and then waved to the patrolmen to come over to clean the wound and bandage it. In order to compress and stop the bleeding, many team members cut their uniforms into strips with bayonets and tied them near the wound, which made them look like a group of beggars at the moment. Looking at the people in ragged clothes, blood, and exhaustion, Lawrence couldn't help but blame himself. After all, it was his misjudgment of Siro's intention that led to such a battle. When Grosso finished cleaning up the battlefield, Lawrence's wounded were basically dealt with. Fortunately, no one was injured in the internal organs, and most of them were cut on the torso and arms. "Boy, can you still move? Come and talk." Grosso whistled and walked to Lawrence very easily. Lawrence nodded, struggled to get up from the ground, and the 2 found a place to sit on the dock. "You have changed a lot. I often hear your name here." Grosso joked first. Lawrence smiled bitterly and said, "I just did some things. But how did you gather such a large group of people in Ajaccio?" Grosso looked at the sea and recalled, "After escaping from the White Rose that day, I swam to Ajaccio and found a few surviving sailor brothers. We lost our jobs, so we started from scratch at the dock here and developed a small gang. Later, we had a conflict with the one-eyed man and became mortal enemies." Lawrence couldn't help but nod his head in approval. Being able to establish a gang of dozens of people in a place like the West City dock without a root base, it seems that Grosso is indeed capable. "By the way, is the one-eyed dead?" Lawrence asked suddenly. Grosso nodded, without any sympathy for this cruel and arrogant man. "He died. Others' bodies were thrown into the sea, and I kept his." "What were his last words?" "I really want to know." Lawrence also looked at the sea and said casually, "Nothing. They said a bastard named Zero will come to avenge me." Grosso answered nonchalantly. Lawrence turned his head to look at Grosso and asked with a strange expression, "Do you know Zero?" Grosso's face became serious, and he said in a deep voice, "I haven't seen him, but I know that he killed one of my brothers, a brother who has been with me for 8 years. I will not forget this hatred." Lawrence was silent for a moment and decided to tell Grosso what he knew about Zero. The other party saved him more than once, and Lawrence didn't want to be ungrateful and watch Grosso die in Zero's hands inexplicably, and even didn't know what happened until he died. After listening to Lawrence's description, Grosso also fell into a brief silence. If it was really as Lawrence said, Grosso would not be able to avenge his tragically dead brother, and even his own life might be difficult to save. Damn it, at worst I can just pat my ass and find a ship to do my old business. Grosso cursed, but soon lowered his head and said, "It's just that I can't rest until I get revenge for my brother. Maybe I can give you a better place." Lawrence patted Grosso's shoulder and said seriously, "I will kill Zluo, but I need your help." A perfect version in 1619 book bar. "Help? What help?" Grosso frowned and asked. He didn't think that he, the leader of a small gang on the dock, could help the famous Napoleon Bonaparte. Lawrence didn't answer directly, but pointed at Grosso's subordinates and asked, "Do you trust these people of yours?" "Them? Of course. Some of them are brothers who have been friends with me for almost 10 years, and the rest are all subordinates I personally tested and selected." Regardless of how strong their abilities are, at least their loyalty is absolute. Although Grosso was a little surprised, he still answered Lawrence's question seriously. After hearing the answer, Lawrence's eyes lit up. If it was really as Grosso said, then a big problem that troubled him might be solved. How do you feel about you and your people being patrolmen in Ajaccio? Lawrence pointed to his blood-stained uniform and said seriously. Patrolmen? Grosso grinned and pointed at his subordinates and said, I am these people. I can't do it. No, you are very suitable. Zicheng district needs a reshaping of order, so we must reshuffle the existing situation. Lawrence was not joking and explained seriously. Reshuffling the existing situation. Grosso also understood that Lawrence was going to clean up the underground world of the entire Zicheng district. Grosso opened his mouth, but hesitated and didn't know what to say. He knew that Lawrence wanted to attack the gang leaders in Zicheng district, and it was obvious that another group of gang members were the best thugs. Although he had heard about the excellent treatment of patrolmen and Lawrence's reputation, Grosso was still a little hesitant. He didn't like the sense of restraint of living under someone else's roof. Noticing Grosso's hesitation, Lawrence continued to persuade him, you just need to obey my orders. I will not treat you as my subordinate. Besides, I will not give you and your men a single silver coin less of the wealth you deserve. Thanks to book friends 7 Nights Dream and Dio for their recommendation votes and support. Chapter 30 Harvest. How is it? Lawrence asked softly. Grosso glanced at Lawrence's eyes. The things in these eyes were no longer the confusion, uneasiness, and struggle he saw when he first met Lawrence. Then, Grosso closed his eyes, as if thinking about something. He looked at his subordinates not far away. These people were either his young companions who were as close as brothers, or slum teenagers who trusted Grosso. No matter which one, Grosso didn't want to treat them badly. Grosso also believed that his subordinates dreamed of the position of patrolman. I agree, as long as Zillow, the beast, can die. Grosso finally sighed, nodded, and agreed to Lawrence's proposal, then stood up, stretched and said, by the way, One-Eyed Man is dead, and the things in his gang can belong to us. Since he had already promised Lawrence, Grosso was also very tactful to make the property of One-Eyed Man the common property of the patrol team. After Grosso's reminder, Lawrence remembered that One-Eye had quite a bit of wealth, and his private treasury alone contributed 2,000 gold to Lawrence. The two returned to their respective subordinates and agreed to meet at the headquarters of the Sea Snake Gang in an hour. Lawrence first let the seriously injured people return to the base to recuperate, and then told Old Scene and Yarn about the recruitment of Grosso. What? They are gang members, just a group of hooligans. Old Scene reacted the most and almost jumped up in surprise. Yarn said nothing. He had sworn to follow Lawrence alone, and the affairs of the team had almost nothing to do with him. To deal with a group of hooligans, it is best to use another group of hooligans. Lawrence shook his head slightly and insisted on his decision. But, I'm always worried about these people. Old Scene was still very worried and said hesitantly. This problem was actually what Lawrence was worried about. Although Grosso was his savior, the common enemy, Zluo, was still the one who maintained their trust. Once Zluo died, whether Grosso would still obey his orders was unknown to Lawrence. After Grosso and his men officially joined the patrol, we must find a way to divide Grosso's absolute leadership over his subordinates. Lawrence thought of this and glanced at Yarn behind him. Lawrence still remembered the scene of him fighting bloody battles to protect himself. For Yarn, Lawrence would choose to trust him unconditionally. In this case, Yarn, there is a task for you. Lawrence walked to Yarn and said softly, speak directly, my lord, I will not refuse. Yarn did not ask what it was, and answered firmly. Lawrence lowered his voice again and said, I will let you and Grosso stay in the West City District. You have two tasks. One is to cooperate with Grosso to eliminate several major gangs, and the other is to try your best to establish prestige among Grosso's subordinates and seize leadership. Yarn simply nodded and said, understood. Hearing Yarn's answer, Lawrence was slightly relieved. With him and Grosso in the West City District, plus the muskets that Paulie promised to send, it would not be a problem to deal with those gangs after a little training. And with Yarn's reputation in the West City District patrol team, Lawrence would not have to worry about whether Grosso would part ways with him in the future. After resting for a while, Lawrence led everyone to the Sea Snake Gang's station. When Lawrence arrived, Grosso had been waiting there for a long time. In front of him was a large iron warehouse. The walls of the warehouse were covered with rust. It seemed that it had been there for many years. I don't know when it was occupied by the Sea Snake Gang. Since One Eye took all the gang members out when he ambushed Lawrence, there was no one in the warehouse at this time, so Grosso directly sent people to break down the door of the warehouse. The warehouse has 2 floors. The second floor is where the gang members live. Although the simple environment reminds Lawrence of the construction site dormitory in his previous life, it is much more comfortable than those slim shacks. At least living in it will not be exposed to wind and rain. There are many scattered sundries on the first floor, and even a few machetes are thrown on the ground. It seems that this group of rough guys have no habit of collecting on weekdays. In the center of the warehouse, there is a large wooden box covered with oilcloth. No one knows what is inside. As soon as Lawrence entered the door, he ordered Old Scene, take people to search, only cash. Grosso walked forward and pulled off the huge oilcloth, revealing 3 wooden boxes underneath. Grosso glanced at the 3 boxes, and his eyes immediately lit up. He couldn't help but screamed, this damn one-eyed man actually smuggled such good stuff. What is it? Lawrence frowned and walked forward, wondering what could make Grosso, who had seen a lot of wind and waves, so excited. Tobacco, and it's high-end stuff. Look here, it's produced in the Viceroyalty of Brazil, and it's printed with the flag of the Portuguese royal family. It's definitely a high-end stuff that noble gentlemen smoke. Grosso explained while caressing the wooden box, with an unstoppable smile on his face. How much is it worth? Lawrence asked. He never smoked, and was not curious about the high-end tobacco from 200 years ago. He only cared about how much these 3 boxes were worth. It's hard to say. If we find a good buyer, we can sell it for 5,000 gold coins from you Corsicans. Grosso touched his chin and laboriously converted his usual lira into Corsican gold coins. Can you find a seller? Lawrence frowned and asked. Grosso curled his lips, shrugged and boasted, I have been floating on the sea for decades. I have all the routes from America to Venice. I guess many of them are interested in this batch of goods. It belongs to you. Find a way to sell it yourself. The money will be distributed to you in the name of the patrol team. Lawrence knocked on the box and said calmly, a correct version of the book in 1619. The patrol team's permanent expenses in the West City district are naturally not small. The food and daily necessities of these dozens of people alone are not small. Fortunately, after the death of the one-eyed man, Lawrence was surprised. This unexpected wealth was used as the starting fund for the West City District Patrol Team. Okay, this money is estimated to last for half a year. Grosso nodded excitedly and ordered several subordinates to carefully move the boxes back to his headquarters. At the same time, Grosso couldn't help but look up to Lawrence. If it were him, he would definitely embezzle the goods for himself. Unexpectedly, Lawrence gave them up so generously. It might be right to follow this kid. Grosso thought silently. At the same time, Old Scene excitedly led people to carry a heavy wooden box over and said, Lord Bonaparte, we found it. The treasury of the Sea Snake Gang is all in here. Lawrence opened the box and saw a small mountain of gold coins in front of him. It looked more spectacular than the private property of One Eye's 2,000 gold coins. How much is it? Lawrence said, picking up a gold coin and examining it for a moment. After confirming that it was a real coin, he threw it back into the box. There is an account book next to the box, and it records 3,540 coins. This is a private account. It can't be wrong. Old Scene couldn't hold back his excitement and rubbed his hands to answer. Such a number surprised Lawrence a little, but thinking that One Eye was one of the few gang leaders in Zachin district, he understood it. If other leaders were as rich as One Eye, I'm afraid that Paul would be the first one who couldn't sit still and would directly send troops to turn the West City district upside down. Add 3,000 gold to the patrolmen's subsidy share, and the remaining 500 gold will be distributed to the patrolmen who were injured today. Lawrence distributed the huge sum of money skillfully, without leaving even a penny for himself. This scene made Grosso and his subordinates stunned. A mountain of gold was placed in front of them, but Lawrence didn't even look at it and distributed it to his subordinates in 2 sentences. Even the patrolmen under Lawrence, who had already received their share once, couldn't help but look at Lawrence fanatically. The visual impact brought by this box full of gold coins was too great. The experienced Grosso frowned tightly, staring at Lawrence with his eyes. He had traveled on the sea for nearly 20 years, and he had heard that some pirate captains did not love money and gave it all to their subordinates. And the names of those people are still passed down as legends on the seven seas. Grosso thought to himself, this young man might be worth following. Chapter 31 Intelligence. The next day, in the North City district, at Lawrence's home. Although the knife wound on his arm was not serious, Lawrence knew that such an injury still needed some time to rest, otherwise it would inevitably cause hidden diseases. Therefore, Lawrence did not plan to go out for the next few days, and stayed at home, to enjoy a few days of leisure. As for the patrol team in the West City district, Lawrence also let Grosso and Yarn do it, giving them quite loose autonomy. After all, with Yarn restraining Grosso, Lawrence would not worry too much about Grosso doing anything out of line. However, after the arrangements were made, Lawrence was still a little worried, always feeling that the patrol team was still missing something in the West City district. There was a sound of keys turning at the door. It seemed that Anna was back. In addition to going out to buy some daily necessities and food, she would visit her neighbor Mrs. Dura. Anna walked in and looked at Lawrence on the sofa, her mouth slightly puffed up, her eyes full of worry. When Lawrence came home yesterday with gauze wrapped all over his body, Anna was really shocked. She burst into tears and didn't sleep well all night. By the way, sir, do you know? Anna walked to Lawrence's side and sat down, talking about the story she had just heard from Mrs. Duller. Mrs. Sora from Dangcheng district came to Mrs. Duller to order baby shoes today. Mrs. Duller said she must be pregnant. Really? This information may come in handy sometimes, etc. Lawrence responded casually, but Anna's words suddenly made him realize what the patrol team in Zicheng district still lacked. Although Grosso was very capable, he was a newcomer after all. John also lived in the North and South districts and rarely set foot in Zicheng district. Both of them lacked a reliable information channel in Zicheng district. If there is no reliable source of intelligence, making the right decision is as difficult as a blind man touching an elephant. Anna saw Lawrence suddenly froze and couldn't help blinking. She tilted her head slightly to look at Lawrence and said carefully, "Sir, don't you like to hear this?" Then I still. No. Lawrence was excited and grabbed Anna's little hand and said, "Anna, where did you get the news in Zicheng district before?" A faint blush rose on Anna's cheeks. She lowered her head and gently took her hand back, saying, "We have a lot of slum children who get together to share the news they heard. Among the children, there are newspaper boys, some who work in taverns, some who sell small items on the docks, and even some who are in gangs, so we can know the news of all walks of life." Children's gathering. Lawrence closed his eyes and rubbed his temples to think. Compared with recruiting people to form a group of spies, it is obviously the fastest and least expensive way to directly find a way to use these children for one's own benefit. If Lawrence can find a gifted and malleable talent like Anna among these children, he can also consider establishing a professional intelligence department based on these children in the future. Can we contact the leader? Lawrence made up his mind and asked Anna. It should be possible, but sir? Anna nodded slightly and said with some doubt. Lawrence rubbed his forehead and decided to use this information channel for his own use, so he looked at Anna seriously and said, "I have something to trouble you to do." "Of course, sir, please go ahead." Anna hurriedly moved closer to Lawrence and agreed directly. During these days at home, Anna's daily tasks were just to take care of various chores at home. Such simple and easy work really made Anna feel uneasy, especially since Lawrence would pay her 10 gold coins every month. Although these days were the happiest days Anna had ever had, she was also afraid that one day Lawrence would think she was worthless and kick her out. Lawrence was now focused on how to build an intelligence network. He did not notice the girl's thoughts and said directly, "You go find the leader and ask him to record the information exchanged at each gathering. Write 2 copies, one to Grosso at the West City Pier, and one to me. You must record everything in detail. As for the reward, let him and Grosso decide on their own. In addition," Lawrence continued, after receiving the transcript, "help me screen and sort it out, focusing on listing the content about West City and the governor's mansion." "Okay." Anna nodded repeatedly. Her workload was not heavy. Even with these new tasks, she still had plenty of time every day. In addition, Anna had been screening information since she was a child. When she was a guide, she had to check the information she got from the gathering one by one. This was not a difficult task for Anna. Then sir, I will set off now. Anna jumped up from the sofa and bowed slightly to Lawrence. Lawrence nodded and suddenly remembered something. He hurriedly called Anna, who had already walked to the door, and said, "By the way, take this." As he said that, Lawrence took out the seal of his patrol team, which was his proof of his identity as a deputy captain, and threw it to Anna, adding, "Go to the patrol team's station first, find Old Scene, and ask him to send someone in plain clothes to escort you." Although Anna has lived in Sichan district for more than 10 years, Lawrence is not at ease to let her, a young girl, travel through that dangerous area. "Thank you, sir." A perfect version of the book in 16:9. Anna smiled sweetly and carefully put the seal into her pocket, knowing that Lawrence was worried about her safety. It was not until the evening that Anna returned home with a face full of excitement. During this time, Lawrence, who couldn't cook, shamelessly went to Mrs. Dura's house for a lunch. "Sir, it's done." He also copied the news of the latest party for us. As soon as Anna entered the door, she said to Lawrence happily, and handed a stack of papers to Lawrence. Lawrence nodded in approval. Anna was indeed gifted in handling these things, and then took the copied news. These messages were written on the back of the tattered account book paper, and the font was crooked, looking like an abstract painting, but it was still recognizable if you looked carefully. Lawrence was not surprised by this. These children from poor families may not have been to school for a day, and they can't be expected to write these words in a standard way. A farmer on the outskirts of the city lost a horse. The price of whiskey in the Sunset Tavern rose to 3 silver coins per glass. A merchant ship from Spain docked and was recruiting sailors. Governor Paulie only had 2 bites of lunch today. Lawrence looked at a few of them casually. It was indeed all-encompassing and complicated, involving the latest information from all walks of life. There is even information about Governor Paulie's lunch today, which seems to have been leaked by someone working in the restaurant of the governor's mansion. Lawrence knew that he must not underestimate this information. No one knew what kind of conspiracy network would be formed by connecting these seemingly messy little things. How much did their leader ask for? Lawrence handed the manuscript back to Anna with satisfaction and asked casually. 50 gold a month. Grosso said he would pay the money. So cheap. Lawrence was a little surprised, but when he thought that this was just an extracurricular activity for these children in the slums, he understood it. After improving his intelligence channels, Lawrence was also slightly relieved. As his power grew, he gradually had a hunch. Maybe the day when he stepped onto the world stage is not far away. Thanks to the recommendation votes of book friends Floating Life 8 Dreams, occasionally Jiang Hu, and When to Start One Vote. Chapter 32 Major Bonaparte. On the third day, when Lawrence was recovering at home, Grosso sent someone to deliver a letter, indicating that the patrol team had basically established a foothold in the West City district. Although other gangs showed deep hostility to the sudden intervention of the patrol team, the Sea Snake gang's one eye was still dead, so these gangs had to lie dormant and observe for a while. The letter also specifically mentioned John, who Lawrence had planted next to him. In Grosso's words, "I really don't know where you picked up such a good seedling." Grosso did not yet realize John's second purpose, and he was full of praise for this young man who was full of potential and determined. Lawrence was also a little relieved after seeing the letter. If the two of them could cooperate happily, the process of rectifying the West City district could be accelerated a lot. After thinking for a while, Lawrence still picked up a pen and wrote a reply letter, reminding Grosso to make maintaining order in the West City district and winning the support of the people as the first priority, and also to strictly restrain the behavior of his subordinates. John would tell him the specific requirements. After all, Lawrence knew very well that poor and bad places produce unruly people. It was inevitable that Grosso's subordinates would take advantage of their new status to bully people and exploit the people, just like the previous patrol team. In order to maintain the positive image of the patrol team in the hearts of the people, Lawrence rarely used an imperative tone to Grosso, requiring him to discipline his subordinates according to Jan's requirements and treat everyone equally. While Lawrence was writing in the study, the door was knocked hard. The knock was heavy, but very regular. Anna happened to go out, so Lawrence put down his pen and stood up to open the door himself. The knocker stood outside the door, with a very upright posture and sharp features, as if they were cut out by a knife. He didn't speak, but just standing there made people feel intimidated. He was wearing a very conspicuous dark green military uniform, and holding a neatly folded package in his hand. Since the Corsican military uniforms were modeled after the old French uniforms, a soldier's rank was not reflected on the epaulettes, but on the cuffs of the uniforms. Lawrence glanced at his cuffs, which were embroidered with a silver 5-pointed star, indicating that this man was a major officer. "Mr. Bonaparte." The officer saluted neatly and said concisely, "General Paula's order specially grants you the rank of Major of the Corsican Defense Force, directly under the Corsican Governor's office. In addition, you are specially sent to the Northern Corps, to command the 4th Infantry Battalion and temporarily accept the command of the Northern Corps." After that, the officer stretched out his right hand, and Lawrence also stretched out his right hand wrapped in gauze and shook it together. Lawrence only felt that this man's hand strength was unusually strong, and it was covered with calluses. It was very likely that he had been engaged in a blacksmith-like profession before. After shaking hands, the official handover process was over, and the officer felt much more relaxed. He smiled and said, "By the way, I'm Major Trifoli, your adjutant, and I will be sent to the Northern Legion with you." Lawrence nodded. It seemed that this was the adjutant sent by Paulie to supervise him. No matter what, he should establish a good relationship with him first. "Very good, Major Trifoli, come in and have a cup of black tea." Trifoli shook his head seriously and whispered, "General Paulie has ordered that we must set off immediately." "Immediately?" Lawrence frowned slightly. He didn't expect Paulie to act so quickly after making up his mind to bypass the parliament. It seemed that he was really worried about any changes in the plan. Now it was almost mid-February, and the day when the French and the Genoese reached an agreement was getting closer and closer. No wonder Paulie was so anxious. "I understand. Wait for me for a moment." Lawrence nodded and took the package from Trifoli, which contained his personal belongings, and then turned back to the house. He simply ended the letter to Grosso and left a note for Anna, saying that he needed to go out. Lawrence thought for a moment and left his patrol seal on the table, reminding Anna on the note to take the seal to the patrol if she got into trouble. He opened the package, and inside was a major's uniform like Trifoli's, and a silver badge with Lawrence's name, age and brief job information, which was also a proof of identity. After putting on the uniform, Lawrence looked at the silver star on his cuffs and shook his head helplessly. Although he was a school-level officer, the number of the Corsican Defense Force was only more than 3,000. Although this was a large number for Corsica, which had a population of less than 40,000, Lawrence was still just a small figure in Europe. "Major Bonaparte, can we leave?" Trifoli asked when Lawrence had finished packing. Lawrence locked the door and nodded to Trifoli. Since it was estimated that it would take 20 days to leave Ajaccio this time, Lawrence went to the patrol station with Trifoli to talk to Old Scene about some matters. Military people. As soon as the two entered the lobby, they attracted the attention of the patrolmen, who were all wondering what the military was doing in the patrolmen's territory. When everyone saw Lawrence's face clearly, they exclaimed, "Oh my god, it's Lord Bonaparte. He's wearing the uniform of Major in the National Defense Forces. What's going on? Is Lord Bonaparte going to leave office?" Lawrence looked at his subordinates with a smile and was about to explain when Old Scene came down from the second floor and scolded everyone. A perfect version of the book in 1619. "What happened? What are you arguing about?" Before he could finish his words, he saw Lawrence standing in front of him in a military uniform and immediately shouted in panic, "Oh my god. Lord Bonaparte, are you going to be transferred? Whose order is it? Governor Paulie? Oh my god, why doesn't he ask us patrol brothers what we think?" Listening to the series of questions thrown out by Old Scene in a hurry, Lawrence couldn't help laughing and interrupted him with a wave of his hand. Okay, all of you, be quiet. I haven't left my post yet. I just took up a concurrent position in the army." "Concurrently?" Old Scene was stunned. He had never heard of an outsider taking up a concurrent position in the army. After all, that was an area under the absolute control of Paulie. especially the conspicuous silver star on Lawrence's cuff, which was a symbol of a school-level officer, and could also enter the ranks of senior officials in the entire National Defense Force. Such a position is not something that anyone can take up concurrently. The patrolmen, including Old Scene, looked at Lawrence with a little more enthusiasm. This was the man they followed. As Lawrence's power continued to expand, they believed that they would also rise with Lawrence's promotion. Lawrence then waved his hand to signal everyone to withdraw and talk to Old Scene alone, handing over the management of the patrol team during his absence to Old Scene. At the same time, he specifically instructed that, if there was any situation in the West City District, Grosso or Yun came to seek help, they must do their best. Lawrence believed that Zluo would not be honest during his absence. In addition, Lawrence estimated that the 80 muskets that Paulie promised last time would be delivered soon, and he also asked Old Scene to distribute these muskets to his subordinates and practice diligently. After Lawrence and Trifoli walked out of the station, Major Trifoli could not help but look back at the patrol station and said with a strange look, "Major Bonaparte, I have never seen such a cohesive subordinate in the army." Lawrence smiled and joked, "Why? Are you saying that I'm suitable for leading the army?" Major Trifoli nodded seriously and said, "From a soldier's perspective, I think so." However, Major Trifoli would only recite the second half of his sentence in his heart. "From General Paula's perspective, I don't think so." Chapter 33 Rifling. The National Defense Army's camp in Ajaccio is located on the outskirts of Ajaccio. Apart from the Northern Corps, which was used to prevent the Genoese counterattack, the number of troops stationed here was the largest in Corsica. Even so, according to Major Trifoli, the army stationed in Ajaccio, excluding the cooks and shores, had only more than 500 real soldiers. The entire National Defense Army's large force was gathered in the northeast, with more than 2,000 people stationed in the port city of Bastia, which was also the destination that Lawrence and Trifoli were about to set off for. As soon as the two arrived at the gate of the camp, 6 cavalrymen led 8 tall and black horses out of the camp at a fast pace. Lawrence looked at these cavalrymen. They all had polished breastplates on their chests, iron helmets on their heads, and 2 white feathers on the helmets. Even their legs had pure iron greaves. They also carried a leather backpack on their backs, with rolled up bedding tied to the backpack, just like the backpacks on the backs of the line soldiers Lawrence had seen in the movies. Lawrence estimated that the armor and luggage alone weighed 20 kilograms, not to mention the sharp sabers and exquisite flintlock pistols they wore on their waists. "These are the cavalry escorting us to Bastia," Major Trifoli explained. "How many cuirassiers are there?" Lawrence asked with interest as he looked at their equipment. Major Trifoli took the reins from the leading cavalryman, led the 2 black horses behind him, and replied, "Not many, about 50 people. As you can see, these equipment plus horses will cost at least 500 gold, not to mention the cost of training and daily expenses." Lawrence nodded to show that he understood. No matter what era, the cost of cavalry is a huge sum of money. Especially for heavy cavalry like this, the war horse under the crotch must be a first-class good horse, otherwise it cannot bear the weight of the cavalry's armor. Major Trifoli handed over the reins of a horse and asked, "Can you ride a horse?" Lawrence shook his head slightly embarrassedly. He was from an ordinary working-class family in his previous life, and had nothing to do with equestrianism. At most, he spent $10 to take a photo on horseback at the zoo. Major Trifoli had no choice but to help Lawrence get on the horse, and then asked the cuirassiers to hold the reins for him beside Lawrence. Ajaccio is located in the southwest of Corsica. To reach Bastia in the northeast, you have to go around the mountains in the center of Corsica and pass through the coastal plains. According to Major Trifoli, it will take about 2 days and 1 night to arrive. Since most of the population of Corsica is concentrated in Ajaccio and the alluvial plains in the south, Lawrence and his group did not see many villages or settlements as they marched north. During the long and boring journey, Lawrence could only chat with Major Trifoli to relieve his boredom. "By the way, Major Trifoli, you were a blacksmith before." How did you know?" Major Trifoli asked in surprise. Lawrence smiled, pointed to his slightly deformed and calloused hands, and said, "Your hands are very strong, and the calluses at the knuckles are especially thick. So that's how it is." Major Trifoli nodded. touched the knuckles of his right hand, and explained, "I have been a blacksmith for 7 years. After joining the army, I also worked as a quartermaster in the army for a long time, responsible for supervising the production of weapons and equipment." Lawrence nodded, pointed to the short knife on his waist and said casually, "I wonder when I can trouble Major Tripoli to forge a knife for me." This sailor's short knife had many cracks and the handle was loose when Grosso gave it to Lawrence. After the fight with the Sea Snake gang a few days ago, it became even more scarred. Major Tripoli glanced at Lawrence's knife, shook his head slowly and said, "I'm not good at forging knives. I make firearms." Firearms? Lawrence was stunned for a moment, and then his eyes lit up immediately. As a mechanical engineer from the future, he originally wanted to improve the smoothbore musket of the 18th century, but Lawrence, who was away from CNC machine tools and precision processing equipment, found that his hands-on ability was not as good as that of a blacksmith apprentice. Today, he learned that Major Tripoli was a skilled craftsman who was proficient in firearm manufacturing, which made Lawrence's idea possible. "Major Tripoli, have you ever thought about how to improve the accuracy of the musket?" Lawrence suddenly asked. "Improve the accuracy?" Major Tripoli frowned slightly. Although he was familiar with the mechanical structure of the musket, he had not received natural philosophy education, so he naturally did not understand what Lawrence meant. The reason why the smoothbore flintlock musket has poor accuracy is that the bullet is not in close contact with the barrel in the smooth barrel, but there is a certain gap. This makes the bullet collide with each other in the barrel after being fired, and at the moment it leaves the muzzle, it will have a large component velocity perpendicular to the direction of the directrix, which makes the bullet have a large scattering range. Although Major Tripoli had not studied physics, after Lawrence spent a lot of time to explain, he still understood the principle of smoothbore bullets deviating from the trajectory, so he said, "If this is the case, if you want to improve the accuracy, don't you have to reduce the gap between the barrel and the bullet, and make them close together?" Major Tripoli was very interested in firearms. After listening to Lawrence's explanation, he immediately thought about it, but he immediately rejected this plan. "This is impossible. If the lead bullet and the inner diameter of the barrel are exactly the same, it is easy to explode. Moreover, the musket and the lead bullet are both made by hand, and it is impossible to make the caliber of the two consistent without error." In fact, Major Tripoli's idea is not wrong. The barrel of the tank in later generations is a smoothbore gun. In order to improve the accuracy, the method used is to increase the initial velocity of the shell and reduce the gap between the shell and the barrel. It's just that this kind of fine technology could not be realized in the 18th century. Check out the correct version on the 16-9 book forum. Seeing that Major Tripoli understood what he meant so quickly, Lawrence nodded in surprise and reminded him with a smile. "In fact, there is another way. If the bullet moves forward while rotating in the barrel, it will almost move in a straight line, so the scattering range will be very small." Moving forward while rotating? What does that mean? Why? Major Tripoli scratched his head in confusion. He didn't know why the rotating bullet would move in a straight line, nor did he know how to make the bullet rotate in the barrel. Of course, Lawrence couldn't say that this was the effect of angular momentum and torque, so he smiled and made an analogy. "Major Tripoli, have you ever seen a child's toy called a spinning top?" "Spinning top? I have seen it." Major Tripoli touched his chin, wondering what the relationship between a spinning top and a bullet was. "It's hard for a stationary top to stand on the ground, but a spinning top won't fall, no matter how hard you try. That's the reason." Major Tripoli frowned, stroked his beard, and pondered for a long time, occasionally making several obvious inhalation sounds. "It seems to be the reason, but how to make the bullet spin and shoot?" Major Tripoli finally understood the principle, and continued to think. Lawrence smiled and waved his hand, leaving it in suspense, saying that they would discuss it together in the future. First, Lawrence also wanted to establish a friendship with Tripoli on this opportunity, and second, in this remote place, there were no tools, and Lawrence didn't know how to explain to Tripoli the principle of engraving rifling. However, Lawrence himself knew that, although he understood the principle, the actual manufacturing, processing, testing and improvement would have to be done by Major Tripoli, a skilled craftsman. As for rifling, it actually appeared as early as the 15th century, but the accuracy of rifled guns at that time was not greatly improved. The loading time was still very long, and the manufacturing process was also difficult, so it was not popularized. In addition, thanks to Chrislin and What When, Start 1 for their recommendation votes. Chapter 34 Northern Legion. The northern region was sparsely populated. On the way, even the occasional farmers, merchants, and even bandits and thieves who saw the shiny armor and sabers on the cuirassiers would walk away tactfully. Fortunately, after Lawrence told Major Tripoli about the principle of rifles, the two quickly established a good friendship and chatted about everything along the way. During these conversations, Lawrence also learned that all the cuirassiers behind him were directly under the governor's office and did not obey any corps. These cavalrymen were a force that could change the situation on the battlefield. They would use pistols to shoot when charging at the enemy, then draw their sabers and rush into the weak points of the enemy's formation, reload their ammunition when turning around, and then carry out the next round of shooting and charging. Such a high cost, but equally powerful unit made Lawrence very envious, but he also understood that Paulie would never let him intervene in it, and being able to let himself enter the army was already Paulie's bottom line. Although the bumps on the horseback once made Lawrence feel seasick, fortunately, the group finally arrived in Bastia in the evening of the second day after leaving Ajaccio. Because this is the garrison of the Northern Legion, most of the thousands of residents in the city have moved away. Soldiers in military uniforms are basically walking on the streets. Even if there are other people, they are almost all cooks or handymen in the camp. Although Bastia is a port city, due to the small number of residents, the dock is far less lively than Ajaccio. Standing on the seashore and looking out, you can only see small fishing boats from several fishing villages on the outskirts of the city, floating on the sea. The 6 cuirassiers escorted Lawrence and Trifali to Bastia, and then parted with them. As a unit directly under the governor's office, they did not need to report to the Northern Legion. The headquarters of the Legion was set up in the town hall of Bastia, a wooden longhouse with very Corsican characteristics. A white flag was hung at the entrance of the longhouse. On the flag was the profile of a pure black man's face, symbolizing the Corsicans after liberation. It was also the flag of the Republic of Corsica. The guards at the entrance confirmed the identities of Lawrence and Trifle and let them pass. The two met the commander of the Northern Corps, General Says Nathan, in the longhouse. General Nathan was not tall, but he was intimidating without being angry. 2 wisps of mustaches were slightly raised from the corners of his mouth, and his eyes were always narrowed, as if he was looking at someone seriously. "Ah, Major Trifle, I know about you from General Paulie. In addition, Mr. Bonaparte, please sit down." General Nathan walked away from a map of Corsica hanging on the wall, squinting his eyes habitually, staring at Lawrence and Trifle, and asked them to sit down. Lawrence couldn't help but frown. Nathan didn't mention his military rank when he addressed him. The implication was obvious that he didn't regard himself as a military man. Even so, Lawrence still sat calmly in his chair. Such a general who could gain Paulie's trust and lead nearly 2/3 of the entire National Defense Force was definitely not a simple character. "Major Tripoli, according to General Paulie's order, you will take over the 4th Infantry Battalion from now on." General Nathan's voice was very steady. He liked to look people in the eye when he spoke, but he skipped Lawrence and stared at Tripoli. Although Lawrence's face was expressionless, he knew in his heart that this was General Nathan's way of showing off. Paulie's order could not have failed to clearly indicate that he was the commander of the 4th Infantry Battalion, and Major Tripoli was only his adjutant. General Nathan deliberately skipped Lawrence, either because he was pretending to obey Paulie's order, or Paulie had another secret order asking Nathan to do so. Considering that General Nathan was in an important position, it was impossible for him to disobey Paulie's order on such an important matter, so the answer was obvious. Pasquale Paoli. "This old fox doesn't seem to want me to have a comfortable life in the army." Lawrence secretly clenched his fists and thought so. Although he had already figured out Paulie's tricks, Lawrence still sat in his seat silently, as if General Nathan's words had nothing to do with him. Major Trifoli was able to be promoted from a blacksmith to a major trusted by Paulie. He must not be without political acumen. Although he did not receive Paula's secret order, like Clarence, he understood General Nathan's meaning. After thinking for a while, obviously, both General Nathan and Paulie thought that it was the best choice to let Major Trifoli, a real person of Thiz, actually lead the 4th Infantry Battalion, and then Clarence would assist in decision making. Major Trifoli knew that he should pretend to be confused at this time and take over the command of the 4th Infantry Battalion from General Nathan. However, as a craftsman, he was completely attracted by the idea of improving the smoothbore rifle that Clarence mentioned on the road. If he took over the command at this time, even if General Nathan took the opportunity to help him deal with Clarence, Trifoli would not dare to cooperate with Clarence to improve the musket in private. Whether to please his superiors or choose an opportunity to gain fame. After weighing the pros and cons, Trifoli gritted his teeth and said, "Sorry, General Nathan, I'm the adjutant of Major Bonaparte. Please confirm the transfer order sent to you by General Paulie." Nathan was slightly stunned. He didn't believe that Trifoli didn't understand Paula's meaning, and he didn't understand why Trifoli suddenly turned against him. But no matter what, General Nathan could only smile awkwardly, randomly pulled out a piece of paper from a pile of documents, looked at it pretentiously, and said, "Oh, it's my fault. Major Bonaparte should take over the 4th Infantry Battalion, and Major Trifoli should be the adjutant." Clarence couldn't help but snorted in his heart, then stood up and said, "In this case, the opportunity should not be delayed. We will go to the camp now. Goodbye, General Nathan." After that, Clarence patted Trifoli on the shoulder and walked out without looking back. When he reached the door, Clarence stopped and turned back to Nathan and added, "By the way, I hope you won't read out Governor Paula's order next time from a shopping list. This is a bit funny." A perfect version at 1619 book bar. Seeing Nathan crumpling the paper into a ball with his hands shaking with anger, Major Trifoli also hurriedly stood up, bowed to Nathan, and ran out of the house to avoid being affected by General Nathan's anger. Clarence Bonaparte. General Nathan slammed the paper ball on the table and couldn't help muttering to himself. What made him even more angry was that Paulie had specifically instructed him to assist the military operations of the 4th Infantry Battalion as much as possible, which made it unrealistic for Nathan to target Clarence privately. As for the surface, Clarence was a major directly under the governor's office, and Nathan had no right to deal with him in any way. And Clarence knew this very well. He knew that Governor Paulie still needed him at this time, so General Nathan, who was deeply trusted by Paulie, would definitely not have any substantial hostile behavior with him. "Major Bonaparte, where are we going now?" Trifoli ran out of the longhouse and asked Clarence. "Let's go directly to the camp." Clarence glanced at Trifoli and said with a little approval. When Major Trifoli rejected General Nathan just now, Clarence himself was a little surprised, but he quickly realized that Trifoli should be very interested in his idea of improving the smoothbore rifle. Although, even if Trifoli took over the command, Clarence would have a way to seize the actual power in the army, but Trifoli's choice still saved Clarence a lot of trouble and gave Clarence a bold idea. "Maybe I can use this project to completely pull him to my side." Clarence squinted at Major Trifoli. His eyes were very fiery. Thanks to the book friend occasionally Jianghu for the recommendation vote support. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35 Chaos. Bastia was not big, and even before the Northern Legion was stationed, it only had a population of several thousand, so Clarence and Trifoli quickly went around the entire city. However, to their surprise, they still could not find the camp, where the 4th Infantry Battalion was stationed. Even at a crossroads in the center of the city, there were 3 road signs pointing to the camps of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Infantry Battalions, but the 4th Infantry Battalion they led was the only one missing. Seeing that it was getting darker and darker, and Bastia would soon be under curfew, Clarence had to stop a passing soldier and asked, "Soldier, please tell me where the 4th Infantry Battalion is stationed." The soldier glanced at the cuffs of Clarence and Trifoli and saw 2 colonel-level officers in front of him, so he immediately stood at attention and answered with his chest puffed out, "Sir, the 4th Infantry Battalion is not in the city, but stationed in the suburbs north of the city." "Not in the city?" Lawrence looked at Trifoli in confusion, and the other party shook his head in confusion. It was also his first time to come to the Northern Legion. According to Lawrence's observation, there are still many open spaces in Bastia, so the 4th Battalion will not be moved out of the city due to lack of space. Even the vacant houses are enough for a battalion of soldiers to live in. So if you think so, there may be something else going on inside the 4th Infantry Battalion. Trifoli's face looked a little ugly. He also thought of this. After looking at Lawrence in silence, he signaled the soldiers to leave. "What do you think?" Lawrence lowered his head and pondered. Although he expected that Paulie would not give him the elite of the Northern Legion to command, he still had a bad feeling after experiencing such a thing. Trifoli nodded in agreement and said, "It's really a bit strange. I rarely heard about the 4th Battalion when I was in Ajaccio." No matter what, the two of them had to go to the camp to find out. The two hurried to the north of the city, and after asking the surrounding soldiers about the specific location of the camp, they carefully shuttled through the woods at night with the black horse they came on. Bastia was not very prosperous, and the outskirts of the city were even more desolate. It seemed that the forest had never been taken care of by forest rangers, and the overgrown weeds and shrubs made it difficult to move. It was unknown how long Lawrence and Trifoli had walked. Just when they began to suspect that the soldiers had taken the wrong path, they finally saw a few flames not far away through the woods. It was undoubtedly the campfire of the camp. "Thank God, we finally found it. Otherwise we would have to sleep in the trees like monkeys." Major Trifoli patted his chest lightly, breathed a sigh of relief, and said. However, Lawrence's expression was still very solemn, and he said seriously, "If this is really the garrison of the 4th Battalion, it's a bit bad." "Huh? What do you mean?" Major Trifoli was stunned and didn't understand what Lawrence said. "The Genoese fortress is just north of Bastia. Logically, this camp should have the function of an outpost. However, the two of us approached the camp without any cover, but no scouts found us." "Hiss, indeed, this is not right for a camp on the front line." Major Trifoli suddenly realized, and then his expression immediately became as solemn as Lawrence's. Such a detail revealed only one piece of information, that is, the combat effectiveness of the 4th Infantry Battalion might be very worrying. Lawrence pushed aside the dense bushes and walked towards the camp. In a spacious open space, dozens of marching tents were built in a disorderly manner. They were called tents, but more like sticks stuck into the soil and covered with a few pieces of rags. There was no fence around the camp, and squirrels and hares shuttled between the tents at will. The stench of excrement was everywhere in the camp. Lawrence even saw a man taking off his pants and finding a piece of open space to start excreting. There was obviously no curfew here. It was late at night, and there were still a lot of naked men with red faces and ears gathered around a table piled with cards and coins, shouting loudly, as if they were playing some gambling game. If it weren't for the scattered uniforms of the National Defense Army hanging on the cloths line outside the tent, Lawrence would never believe that this was the base of the 4th Battalion. "Oh my god, is this a gathering place for wanderers?" Major Trifoli was even more shocked. "Even the bandits' nest is neater and more orderly than this." "Humph, I guess the Genoese people thought it was a gathering of local hooligans." Lawrence sneered. He and Trifoli were standing at the edge of the camp without hiding, but no one even noticed them. 3 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Damn it, why is it 7 o'clock? A soldier sitting at the wooden table licked his lips and turned over the bottom card. When he found that it was not the card he wanted, he cursed and then reluctantly threw 2 silver coins into the pile of coins on the table. The dealer tonight was a bald fat man, with disgusting fat piled up tightly together. Seeing the increasing amount of coins on the table, he couldn't help but grin and continued to call out, come on, are there any players? Blackjack. Suddenly, a voice came from the crowd. "I want to play around." The fat man was slightly stunned. This voice was very unfamiliar. He had never heard it in the camp, so he looked up. He saw Lawrence standing in front of the gambling table, slowly taking out a pistol and loading it with gunpowder. Seeing the fat man standing there in a daze, Lawrence smiled and said, "What's wrong? I want to gamble too." You are a major?" The fat man hurriedly stood up from the table in panic, and the soldiers around him hurriedly came up to watch. They were used to lawlessness and just wanted to see what fun there was. Read the correct version in the 16:9 book bar. What's wrong with the major? Can't you play? Lawrence put the pistol on the table, sat down with a smile, and looked at the fat man and said softly, "Haha, of course, of course." The fat man thought Lawrence really wanted to play 2 rounds, so he quickly forced a smile and asked, "Sir, what is your bet?" "My bet? This," Lawrence said, picking up the pistol on the table and holding it in his hand. "Ah, it's a beautiful pistol, sir. I believe it's worth a lot." The fat man looked at Lawrence's pistol greedily, rubbing his hands and said. However, before he finished speaking, he was interrupted by Lawrence. Lawrence raised his pistol, pointed it at the fat man's forehead, and said with a smile, "No, my bet is your life. If I win, you die, and if I lose, you live. Deal the cards." What? Not only the fat man, but also the soldiers watching, were in an uproar, with stunned expressions on their faces, not knowing what the strange major meant. "Sir, don't joke, haha." The black muzzle of the gun was pointed at his forehead, and the fat man had already been scared and sweated, and said tremblingly, "What? You won't deal the cards? If you don't deal the cards, you will be judged as losing due to overtime," Lawrence said casually. The fat man raised his arm to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead, opened his mouth to say something, but he was so frightened that he stammered and couldn't say anything. "Unfortunately, the time is up." The fat man only heard this last sentence, followed by the sound of gunpowder exploding, and then he fell to the ground in a bloody mess. After the gunshots, this was definitely the quietest moment in the camp of the 4th Battalion. Every soldier was stunned and held his breath, as if time had stopped. Only Lawrence stood up silently, twirled the pistol in his hand, glanced at everyone, and asked coldly, "Does anyone else want to bet with me?" Chapter 36 Military Camp. Wasn't the atmosphere very lively just now? Why did it become cold when I came? Lawrence continued to ask, and at the same time, he swept his eyes across the eyes of all the soldiers watching. Every soldier who met Lawrence's eyes quickly lowered his head and said nothing. "I'm Napoleon Bonaparte, the commander of the 4th Infantry Battalion, and this is my adjutant, Major Trifoli." Lawrence loudly stated his and Trifoli's identities, and then asked the soldiers, "How many companies are there in the 4th Battalion?" The soldiers responded sparsely, 2. Lawrence frowned slightly. The number of people in a company should be about 120. The 4th Battalion only has 2 companies, which means that the number will not exceed 300. Under normal circumstances, a battalion should have about 500 people. Lawrence glanced at the tents in the camp with the corner of his eye. Judging from the number of tents, there are indeed only more than 200 people. There is no doubt that Paulie must have deliberately given the 4th Battalion to Lawrence in order to minimize his influence and the were matched. Not only did Paul give me a bunch of rubbish, he also cut corners. Lawrence couldn't help shaking his head. It seemed that Paul didn't want him to interfere too much in military affairs. Putting Paul's thoughts behind him, Lawrence still had to quickly deal with the problems within the 4th Battalion. "Where are the captains of the 2 companies? Step out," Lawrence shouted. Then, a middle-aged man with a full beard stood out with a face full of panic and uneasiness. The pattern on his sleeve indicated that he was a lieutenant. After Lawrence waited for a while, no other captain stepped out, so he couldn't help asking, "Where is the other captain?" The lieutenant who stepped out said carefully, "Report to the commander, the other captain has just been shot by you." Looking at the fat man lying in a pool of blood, Lawrence couldn't help but sigh that it was no wonder that the fat man could be the banker at the gambling table. It turned out that he had a half-official position. "You, come with me," Lawrence said to the lieutenant, and then took Trifoli and the 3 of them to the outside of the camp. "For this camp full of fesses and flies, I really don't know how these soldiers endure it." "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Set, the captain of the 1st Company," Lieutenant Set said with lingering fear, and couldn't help but look at the body of the fat man in the distance. Until now, no soldier dared to come forward to collect his body. Lawrence was too lazy to talk nonsense, and directly asked the question he was most concerned about. "Why is the 4th Battalion so chaotic?" Lieutenant Set hesitated for a while, with a bitter look on his face, and said, "The soldiers of the 4th Battalion are not recruited normally. They are basically prisoners sent from prisons, or forcibly recruited from vagrants. In the early days, when Paulie assembled his army to fight against the Genoese, when the war was very tense, Paulie had to incorporate criminals, ruffians, and vagrants into the army. On the one hand, it could increase the strength of the army, and on the other hand, it also stabilized the public security order in the rear." Lawrence nodded to show his understanding. This kind of behavior of conscripting men is still common in this era. Now that the war situation is very favorable, these conscripted cannon fodders have lost their value. This must be the reason why the 4th Battalion is not stationed in the city, but in the suburbs. After all, the regular army in the National Defense Force will inevitably discriminate against these conscripts with low quality and weak combat power. How many people are there in the 4th Battalion now? Lawrence frowned and asked. Although he understood the situation of the 4th Battalion, he did not expect to lead such a force to complete the task of attracting the Genoese to attack. At that time, if the 4th Battalion was pulled to the Genoese fortress, the other party might think that they were refugees from somewhere. Lieutenant Seth swallowed his saliva, hesitating for a long time before answering Lawrence's question. "I don't know either. There hasn't been roll call here for a long time. Anyone who wants to go home can leave directly. However, you can still get your salary here, so many people will go home for a while and then return to the camp. Anyway, we play cards and drink every day here." Even Lawrence couldn't help but twitching his mouth when he heard such an answer. This didn't look like a military at all. It was more like a large welfare institution. You can come and go as you please, and you can get a salary. What about the weapons? Where are your muskets stored? Lawrence's brows were never relaxed. The problems existing in the 4th Battalion were really beyond his expectations. Muscles. Lieutenant Seth looked like he was about to cry. He glanced at the fat man lying on the ground anxiously and said, "Everyone secretly took them to sell for money. Anyway, there has been no war for a long time, and even if there is a war, it will not be us who will fight. I know, you can go back." Lawrence waved his hand at Lieutenant Seth unhappily. He was afraid that, if he continued to find out, he would be so angry that he would shoot Lieutenant Seth on the spot. After Lieutenant Seth slipped away, as if he had been pardoned, Major Trifle asked with a worried look on his face, "How can we do this? With this group of people, let alone fighting, it may not be realistic to drag them for 5 miles. No matter what, we must restore order tomorrow." Lawrence nodded. Major Trifle sighed. "That being said, what are you going to do?" Lawrence yawned, took the blanket from the horse bag, and said, "It's nothing more than a word. Carrot and stick, kindness and force. By the way, do you know those cuirassiers who escorted us?" Although Trifle didn't know why Lawrence suddenly mentioned this, he nodded and said, "I'm quite familiar with them. In fact, most of the cuirassiers' pistols were made by me, and I got to know them when they were customized." "Very good. Let's go back to Bastia tomorrow. I'll go to request supplies, and you ask those cuirassiers to go back to the camp with us in your personal name." After that, before Trifle could ask about the purpose of these cuirassiers, Lawrence had already found a pine tree to sit down, covered with a blanket, and prepared to fall asleep. The next morning, in addition to the calls of hundreds of birds in the woods, you can also vaguely hear the sound of commands and shouts coming from the direction of Bastia not far away. It seems that the Northern Legion's daily training. Lawrence and Trifle got up early and looked at the still silent camp. They estimated that this group of people would not get up before noon. The two parted ways after returning to Bastia. Trifle followed Lawrence's instructions to ask for 6 cuirassiers to accompany him. Lawrence stood on the street and thought about how to negotiate with General Nathan. After all, he had just parted ways with Nathan yesterday evening. Now he had to brazenly ask for a batch of supplies. He had to prepare a good excuse. Just when Lawrence was standing on the street and almost made up his mind, a dozen soldiers carrying wooden boxes walked in front of him one by one. Each box was not sealed, and the contents of the box were actually golden coins. Even if the 2 boxes of gold coins in one eye were added together, they were not half of the gold coins in any box here, and there were more than 10 boxes of such gold coins. Lawrence could not help but feel a little surprised. He waved his hand to stop a lieutenant in the lead and asked, "What are all these money for?" The lieutenant did not want to answer at first, but after seeing Lawrence's rank, he hurriedly explained, "Sir, this is not a Corsican gold coin. It is a counterfeit coin made by the Genoese to disrupt our monetary system. Sir, you can find the difference if you look carefully." Lawrence took a coin out of the box and looked at it carefully for a moment. He found that the coin was exactly the same as the Corsican gold coin in terms of size and style, but the color was much darker. It was probably that brass was used instead of gold inside. However, if you don't look carefully at it in the sun, it is really not easy for ordinary people to find it. Although the density of brass is much lower than that of gold, it is difficult to feel the difference in weight if it is just 1 or 2 coins. These little gadgets might be useful. Gently throwing the counterfeit coin back into the box, Lawrence suddenly had an idea and decided to add the counterfeit coins when requesting supplies from Nathan. Thanks to the book Friends Fashion Bayu Meng, occasionally Jiang Hu, went to start voting 1 and 7 night stream for their recommendation votes. Chapter 37 Rectification, Part 1. "Ah, I heard you were looking for me, Major Bonaparte." General Nathan was having breakfast, 2 pieces of soft and delicious sweet bread and 3 fried egg pancakes. He didn't even look up when he saw Lawrence come in, but just greeted him casually. Lawrence smiled and pulled out a chair to sit down, saying, "See you again, General Nathan. I hope we won't meet again, Major Bonaparte. According to the schedule, you should be training the 4th Infantry Battalion." General Nathan said, took out a handkerchief, rubbed the corners of his mouth, and kept his eyes on his dining table. "Of course, but you also know the situation of the 4th Battalion. It needs some extra supplies," Lawrence said slowly. After hearing this, General Nathan sneered inaudibly, raised his head, and almost looked at Lawrence with his nose, and said, "I'm sorry, Major, all the troops are in short supply. For both public and private reasons." Lawrence didn't expect General Nathan to directly agree to his request, but fortunately, this was also within Lawrence's expectations. In order to force Nathan to accept his request, Lawrence had to bring out his trump card, Governor Pauly. "I understand your difficulties, General, but you should also know why I went to Bastia from Ajaccio under the order of General Pauly," Lawrence said mysteriously. He knew that Pauly would not reveal the withdrawal plan to Nathan, otherwise he would not need to carry out this task himself, and Nathan could just do it himself. Nathan frowned after hearing this. As Pauly's confidant, although he was not informed of the content of the plan, he did know that an extremely important plan was being brewed in the governor's palace in Ajaccio, and the young man in front of him was one of the few people who knew about this plan, or perhaps the only one. Seeing that Nathan did not respond, Lawrence said in an exaggerated manner, "Oh my god, you didn't know. Please forgive my abruptness." "Enough, Major Bonaparte, what do you want to say?" Nathan looked at Lawrence with cold eyes, and there was a hint of anger in his tone. In his opinion, Lawrence was mocking him for not being informed of the plan as a confidant of Pauly. "In order to carry out the plan, I need a batch of supplies and equipment," Lawrence said directly, and then raised his voice and added, "Of course, you can refuse, but if all the efforts of this plan are in vain, I'm happy for General Nathan to take this responsibility for me." Nathan stared at Lawrence closely, took a deep breath, and said with all his strength, "I need to ask General Pauly." Lawrence shrugged his shoulders pretending to be indifferent and said, okay, but it takes 4 days to get back to Ajaccio from Bastia. I hope your messenger can get back before the plan of General Pauly and I fails." If these words were said by ordinary people, General Nathan would have taken off his belt and started to whip him, but Nathan didn't dare to do anything to this major, appointed by Pauly himself. Moreover, Lawrence's words did make Nathan a little afraid. If this plan of who knows what really failed, would he have a share of his responsibility? Nathan didn't know. "Major, what do you need?" These words were almost squeezed out by Nathan from his teeth. Lawrence sneered in his heart, and couldn't help but sigh that his guess was indeed correct. Such a general who relied on Paul's trust, and held a high position would not risk offending Paul to be tough on him. Guns, gunpowder, bullets, new uniforms, boots, marching tents, engineer shovels, and Lawrence listed a series of supplies, but they were all very common supplies, so Nathan simply agreed to all of them. Only for muskets, Due to the lack of inventory, Nathan only gave Lawrence 100 old-fashioned smoothbore rifles. General Nathan's face was full of haze. He stamped the list of supplies just approved to Lawrence and said very reluctantly, "Major, take the list to find the quartermaster and please leave if there is nothing else. Oh, I almost forgot, there is another item." Lawrence slapped his thigh and said quickly, "It seems that a batch of counterfeit currency has been seized recently. I also need 2 boxes of that. Don't push it too far, these counterfeit currency cannot flow out." Nathan slammed the table angrily and scolded, "It's just a prop for a play. I will return it without missing a penny." Lawrence remained calm and smiled in response. "Besides, this is part of the plan. You." Nathan's face flushed and he clenched his fists, but he couldn't say anything. He knew almost nothing about the plan, but he couldn't risk offending poorly by refusing Lawrence. As long as Lawrence didn't make excessive demands, Nathan had to consider his possible responsibility before refusing. A perfect version in 16:9 book bar. After walking out of the longhouse, Lawrence took the list to Bastia's quartermaster. When the other party received the list, his face was still very strange. He didn't know why General Nathan approved a large amount of supplies for the 4th Battalion. After confirming the seal on it, the quartermaster had to execute the order and said that all the supplies would be prepared and delivered to the 4th Battalion's camp within tomorrow. However, as for the boxes of counterfeit currency, Lawrence said that they were needed now, so the quartermaster had to send a few orderly soldiers to carry 2 boxes with Lawrence. When Lawrence led several orderly soldiers to the place agreed with Trifoli, the other party had obviously been waiting for a long time. The 6 cuirassiers also wore full sets of armor and weapons, waiting patiently in place, and the sabers on their waists were particularly dazzling under the midday sun. Major Bonaparte, seeing Lawrence coming, the leading cavalry drove his warhorse to walk towards him in a small step and said with a somewhat unfriendly look, "Although Major Trifoli invited us in a private capacity, please know that if General Pauline knew that you dispatched the cuirassiers without authorization, he would be furious." Lawrence stroked the mane of the warhorse under his crotch with his hand, shook his head and said, No, I didn't dispatch you without authorization." "What do you mean?" The cavalry was stunned, not knowing what Lawrence was talking about. "Major Trifoli is your good friend. If he is in danger, you will not stand by and watch him die, right?" "Danger? What's the danger in Bastia?" the cavalryman said with a frown. Lawrence smiled and patted the dagger at his waist, looking at the direction of the 4th Battalion and said, "If he and I kill people in the 4th Battalion, it will inevitably cause a mutiny. Then, Major Trifoli will be in danger." The cavalrymen took a breath and couldn't help saying, "Kill people? They are all soldiers of the National Defense Army. Why kill them? How many do you want to kill?" Lawrence took the reins from Trifoli, jumped on his horse, and rode slowly towards the camp of the 4th Battalion, and said coldly, "Kill them until they obey." Chapter 38 Rectification, Part 2. In the camp of the 4th Battalion, Lieutenant Seth sat up from the bed bored uneasily. After Lawrence's questioning last night, he lay in bed anxiously all night without sleep. The scene of the fat man lying in a pool of blood was constantly replayed in his eyes. Have the 2 officers left? Lieutenant Seth walked out of the tent, not even bothering to wash up. He first walked around the camp and confirmed that the officer and his adjutant from last night were not in the camp. Then he breathed a sigh of relief. Lieutenant Seth. Not far away, a bald man who was not wearing a shirt, but only a military jacket on his body shouted at Seth. "Ah, Corporal Kukin." Lieutenant Seth looked at the bald man with some fear, but responded to his greeting enthusiastically. Although Kukin was just a corporal in the 4th Battalion, he relied on his smooth personality and strong muscles to become brothers with many soldiers and formed a small group of considerable size. Lieutenant Seth, the company commander with an empty title, was not as charismatic as a corporal like Kukin. Even in the gambling game every night, he and the fat man took turns to be the banker, which was also a manifestation of their privilege. Kukin whistled and walked up to Lieutenant Seth. "Those 2 men killed the fat man last night, and we didn't show any support." In his words, it seemed as if he treated Lieutenant Seth as his subordinate. Lieutenant Seth resisted the urge to get angry, swallowed his anger, shrugged helplessly and said, "Those are 2 majors, and they are our battalion commanders. What can you do? What's wrong with the majors? What can he do to us? Remember the last battalion commander? The last one. Didn't he leave after 2 days?" Kujin slapped his head, smiled grimly, and said, "Oh, sorry, it should be the one before that." Lieutenant Seth rolled his eyes and recalled, "The one before that? That was 2 years ago. You deliberately had a conflict with him, and then found a scapegoat. Since there was a first time, there can be a second time." Kujin licked his lips, looked at Lieutenant Seth, and said, "Do you want to join us?" Lieutenant Seth hesitated and wanted to nod in agreement, but suddenly thought of Lawrence's cold eyes and the fat man's tragic death, and suddenly felt a chill on his back. No, I still have something to do." Lieutenant Seth waved his hand and quickly left. At the same time, after Lawrence and his party arrived at the woods not far from the camp, Lawrence signaled the cuirassiers and the orderly to hide here temporarily, and he and Trifoli entered the camp first, so that they would come out after hearing the movement inside. "Sir." Lieutenant Seth discovered Lawrence and Trifoli early this time, and hurriedly stepped forward to salute. Lawrence nodded slightly in return and ordered, "Lieutenant, order all soldiers to gather here, only 3 minutes." Lieutenant Seth's pupils shrank slightly, and he had a bad premonition that the lawless life of the 4th Battalion might end from today. "Yes, I'll do it right away." Lieutenant Seth saluted again, and then hurried to gather the soldiers. The 3 minutes stipulated by Lawrence passed quickly, and a group of loose and untidy soldiers gathered in front of him. They didn't even have a basic formation, and casually formed a semicircle, and stood in front of Lawrence. Even college students and later generations know to stand in line properly on the first day of military training. Lawrence thought helplessly. Although they were urgently summoned, everyone's face looked indifferent, or watching the fun. "Lieutenant, is everyone here?" Lawrence casually looked at the crowd. Although he didn't know the exact number of the 4th Battalion, the soldiers in front of him were definitely less than 200. Lieutenant Seth scratched his head awkwardly and whispered in Lawrence's ear, "There are so many dozens of people who said they are sick. Sick. Let them come over. Carry all those who can't walk over. I will treat them." Lawrence raised his eyes and ordered impatiently, "It's easy to know that there are dozens of people who are sick and can't line up. Even if they need to report illness, they need to get the consent of their superior. It seems that what we did last night was too much, which aroused the resistance of some people. Humph, but it's good this way." Lawrence didn't care about those who disobeyed orders. They were just good materials for him to establish his authority. Lieutenant Seth hesitated for a moment, but still quickly ran to the tents deepest in the camp. About 2 minutes later, Lieutenant Seth led a large group of people to Lawrence, and all of them had ruddy faces and steady steps, and they didn't look sick at all. Lawrence took a look, and saw that the leader was a bald man who casually put on his coat. Lieutenant Seth trotted to Lawrence, and reminded him that this man's name was Kujin, and he was the leader of these people. When Lawrence looked at Kujin, Kujin also observed Lawrence with disdain. The light was too dim last night to see clearly. At this time, Kujin realized that Lawrence was definitely a nobleman who was no more than 20 years old, and his disdainful expression suddenly became stronger. "Sir, I heard that you are going to treat our illnesses? That's great." Corporal Kujin twitched his mouth and looked at Lawrence provocatively. "However, I think you should treat yourself first. A pretty boy like you doesn't lie on the beds of those noble ladies in Ajaccio, but runs to the army. There must be something wrong with your brain. It doesn't matter what my problem is, but I heard that you are sick and can't come to the assembly. As a commander, I'm very sad." Lawrence replied with a calm smile, stretched out his hand to untie the cloth bag on his belt, and said, "I have a bag of medicine powder here, which can cure all diseases. Do you want to try it?" "Damn it, you are being mysterious. What kind of tricks are you playing?" Corporal Kujin cursed in a low voice, then looked up at Lawrence and said disdainfully, "Check out the correct version at 1619 book bar." "Okay, I'll try." After saying that, Corporal Kujin threw his coat directly on the ground, revealing his muscular upper body, walked in front of Lawrence, shook his legs arrogantly, and said, "Come on, sir." Lawrence smiled and took a handful of black powder from the cloth bag, and poured it on Kujin's body, covering his whole body. What is this? Kujin couldn't help but sniff his nose and felt that the smell of this powder was very familiar. Do you know that in the country that invented gunpowder was originally used as a medicine? Lawrence said, took out a match from the horse bag and lit it, and before Kujin had any time to react, he threw it directly on his body, covered with gunpowder powder. The orange-yellow fireworks suddenly burned, accompanied by the tragic wailing of Corporal Kujin. He immediately fell to the ground and rolled wildly, but he could not suppress the flames all over his body. The air was filled with the smell of burning, and even the ground under Kujin was covered with the layer of grease produced during the burning. All the soldiers were stunned, even Major Triffer's eyes widened. No one expected Lawrence to be so decisive. It was not until half a minute later, when Kujin's wailing had turned into a weak gasp and even wisps of black smoke began to come out of his body, that some soldiers reacted and shouted loudly, "Quick! Go get a bucket! Hurry up! It's next to the well!" Lawrence shouted, "Let's see who dares." Several soldiers who were about to leave the team to get a bucket looked back at Lawrence in horror, only to see him aiming a pistol at them, his face so cold that water could drip out of it. "Did I agree to your leaving the team?" Lawrence asked coldly while he was moving between the soldiers with the muzzle of his gun. Those soldiers looked at each other, couldn't help swallowing, and hurried back to the team under the pressure of Lawrence's gun. Murder. This is murder. Go get me some water." Kujin endured the burning pain all over his body, lying on the grass, and turned back to shout at his followers. Others, "Kill him." The more than 30 people behind Kujin looked at each other, and the few people in the back row quickly turned around and ran to the well, while the people in the front row gritted their teeth and stepped forward to rush towards Lawrence. "I'll say it again, let's see who dares." Lawrence shouted in a deep voice, pointed the muzzle of the gun at the sky, and pulled the trigger. The 6 cuirassiers who had been waiting in the woods for a long time heard the gunshots and instantly jumped out of the woods on horseback, drew their sabers in their right hands, and skillfully took out their pistols with their left hands and aimed at the soldiers approaching Lawrence and Triffery. Chapter 39 Rectification, Part 2. These are cuirassiers. The moment the cavalry rushed out of the woods, the soldiers who were trying to attack Lawrence stopped in panic. They were not carrying any weapons when they were assembled, and the few muskets they had were still lying in the tent. If the fully armed cuirassiers charged them, it would be easier to cut off their heads with sharp sabers than to cut wheat with sickles. Just the 6 horses in front of them, which were as tall as a man, were not something they could handle if they were to run rampant in the crowd. Some soldiers with quick minds had already reacted and hurriedly knelt on the ground and raised their hands, while others could not help but tremble all over and shrank back. Fortunately, these cavalrymen only came to protect Lawrence and Triffery and did not attack these soldiers. They just formed a circle to protect Lawrence and Triffery and at the same time raised their guns to intimidate these soldiers who dared to offend. "Fire!" Lawrence ordered while loading his pistol. "They have given up resistance." The leading cuirassiers glanced at Lawrence and frowned. "No, blood must be shed today," Lawrence insisted. "Please note, Major Bonaparte, we are here as friends of Major Triffery and do not accept your command." Lawrence sighed slightly, but also admitted that the cavalryman was right. So he personally stepped forward, raised the muzzle of his gun to the soldier in the front row, and pulled the trigger without hesitation under his terrified gaze. Another gunshot, the soldier fell down, and the back of his head hit the ground heavily. "Major, he has obviously given up resistance." The cavalryman frowned even more. "His death is more valuable to me than his life," Lawrence said slowly as he put away his pistol. The rest of the soldiers were completely scared, and the crotch of several of them was already wet. No one foolishly chose to run away. In front of these war horses, they could not run a few steps. Not far away, several soldiers had brought buckets of water and poured them directly on the dying Kujin, but it was no use. His pants were completely stuck to his skin in the flames, and his exposed upper body was charred black, with no intact skin visible. Although his face was not on fire, it was distorted due to extreme pain. Lawrence walked to Kujin and saw that his chest was still slightly heaving, so he pulled out his dagger and stabbed it into Kujin's chest, which helped him get rid of it. "And you?" Lawrence put the still bleeding blade back into his waist, looked at the people who had just rushed towards him, and said coldly, "For openly attacking the commander, I will execute you on the spot." These soldiers' hearts suddenly trembled, and they felt a chill on their backs. However, Lawrence continued, "However, for the sake of your military uniforms, I can spare your lives, but..." Some smarter soldiers quickly knelt on the ground and said hurriedly, "Just say it, Commander, we can do anything." "Very good." Lawrence nodded. It was easier to talk to smart people. "From today on, in every battle, you dozens of people will be the front row, and in the siege, you dozens of people will be the vanguard. Can you accept it?" In the line tactics, the soldiers in the first row will undoubtedly be directly exposed to the enemy's firepower, which also makes the casualties of the soldiers in the first row high. "Sir, can we not accept this?" someone asked timidly. Lawrence rolled his eyes at him and said directly, "If you don't accept it, you will die now." At this point, these people dared not say anything anymore, and could only nod to accept Lawrence's proposal. Lawrence also asked Lieutenant Set to copy down the names of these people, and ordered Major Trefali to supervise in every battle. "As for you," Lawrence turned his head to look at the other soldiers, and asked them sternly at their loose formation, "Don't you even know that you have to stand in a square formation when you assemble? Or do you want to disobey me on purpose?" The soldiers' hearts tightened, and they secretly complained. They watched Kujan being burned to death by Lawrence, watched a man being shot by Lawrence, and watched dozens of soldiers being pushed to the front line by Lawrence. Who would have the courage to disobey? As Lawrence's voice fell, a sound of footsteps sounded below, and in just an instant, everyone raised their heads and chests, and formed a neat square formation. A correct version of the book in 16:9. As the saying goes, one slap gets two dates. After establishing his prestige, Lawrence also knew that he should give these people some sweet treats, otherwise, under high pressure, such rebellion will continue to happen today. He gave a look to Major Trefali and signaled him to notify the orderly soldiers to bring the boxes over. "I know what you are thinking at this moment." Lawrence then looked at the soldiers below and said loudly, "You all think I'm a devil, an executioner, and a cruel and unjust commander. But you are wrong. I will not hesitate to show my cruelty and terror to my enemies, but for my brothers, I will not hesitate to share wealth and glory with them." Along with Lawrence's inspiring words, the orderly brought up the boxes full of gold coins and placed them right in front of everyone at Lawrence's signal. The two large wooden boxes, more than 1 meter long and wide, and half a person's height, were filled with glittering gold coins, and a lot of them almost fell out during the moving process. "Now, I have sent my enemies to God to repent, and there is no need for me to show you cruelty and terror. If you have relatives living in Ajaccio, please write to ask how Lawrence Bonaparte treats his brothers, and how Lawrence Bonaparte leads his brothers to glory and wealth." Lawrence raised his arms, clenched his fists in front of his chest, and shouted excitedly, "Those who are willing to follow me, I can make a covenant with you. As long as you offer me your sincere loyalty, 1 year later, I will reward you with all the wealth in front of me, and I will let your name resound in Corsica and even the whole of Sardinia. And those who don't want to follow me, I can let you go, because you will witness the glory forged by Lawrence Bonaparte and his brothers." As he said, Lawrence reached into the box full of gold coins and took a handful. After grabbing a handful of gold coins, he let them fall from his fingers, making a tinkling sound. No one thought about the tragic death of Kukin anymore. The gold coins in front of them, which shone brightly and made pleasant sounds, were the most attractive thing. All the soldiers stared at them. They were originally recruited from gangsters, bandits and refugees. They had never seen so many coins piled together in their lives. Some people even thought naively, there must be all the gold coins in Corsica in here. Looking at the soldiers' enthusiastic eyes, Lawrence knew that this play was effective, so he continued to shout, "Now, it's time for you to make a decision. Except for those who offended me just now, they must atone for their actions. The rest of you, if you don't want to follow me, can pack up and leave. I will come back here tomorrow." After that, Lawrence turned around and signaled the orderly to take the box away. He left the camp with Trifle and the cuirassiers, leaving all the choices to the soldiers present. Chapter 40, Withdrawal, Part 1. "Oh my god, Major Bonaparte, those are 2 boxes of counterfeit coins. I have to admit that your speech is excellent, but are you going to give them these counterfeit coins to them in a year?" Major Trifalil was riding on his horse, holding a box of gold coins, and looking at them in amazement, and said worriedly. Lawrence shook his head firmly. Although these soldiers had offended him a lot in the past 2 days, as long as they chose to follow him, Lawrence would definitely not use these tricks to repay their loyalty. Swords and guns and tricks are reserved for the enemy. For those whom Lawrence has identified as his own, he will never treat them badly. Now the group is on the way back to Bastia. On the one hand, they are accompanying the cuirassiers on their return journey. They have helped Lawrence a lot just now. On the other hand, they want to return these counterfeit coins as soon as possible. After all, Lawrence also knows that if a large number of counterfeit coins are circulated in the market, it will be a fatal blow to a small economy like Corsica. On the streets of Bastia, Lawrence shook hands and said goodbye to the leading cuirassiers. After listening to Lawrence's exciting speech, the cavalryman also understood that Lawrence's attack on those soldiers was not to kill innocent people, but to win over those undisciplined soldiers to his own command as quickly as possible. Major Bonaparte, I have to admit that you are very capable, the cavalryman said with conviction. Lawrence smiled and said casually, of course, it is not as good as your superior, General Paula's methods. The cavalryman's face changed immediately after hearing this. He didn't know whether Lawrence said this as a casual joke or with ulterior motives. If there were ulterior motives, the meaning of this statement that deliberately compared himself with Paulie would be very obvious. After considering for a few seconds, the cavalryman replied cautiously, maybe, Major, you are still so young, and no one can predict the future. That's right. Lawrence held his hand, patted the cavalryman's shoulder intimately, and said goodbye to him. After completing the escort mission, they needed to return to Ajaccio to report. After bidding farewell to the cavalry, Lawrence and Trifoli returned the 2 boxes of counterfeit money to the quartermaster in Bastia. Due to the large number of counterfeit money, the quartermaster just glanced at it casually and accepted it after he was sure it was correct. As for the batch of supplies needed by the 4th Battalion, the quartermaster said that it was still being allocated and would be sent within tomorrow. Before leaving, Lawrence asked the quartermaster for a map of the surrounding areas of Bastia. The situation inside the 4th Battalion was basically dealt with, and it was time to start preparing to attract the Genoese to take the initiative to attack. Then the two of them randomly found an empty, unlocked house on the street to stay for half a day. As for why they did not return to the camp, Lawrence also considered that the soldiers needed to be given sufficient time to consider and adapt. In addition, it was because the stinking environment in the camp was really unbearable for Lawrence. So, what is our mission? Major Trifoli spread the map he had just received on the table and skillfully marked the locations of various strategic points on the map with a graphite pen. Lawrence looked at the map and thought for a moment. He really had no experience in marching and fighting, so he could only come up with a general plan. The specific implementation still depended on the experienced soldier Trifoli to plan. 70 miles north of Bastia, there is this Genoese fortress. What is the situation of the garrison inside? Lawrence pointed to the map and asked Trifoli. Although Major Trifoli was also in Bastia for the first time, he had the right to know many reports sent back from the Northern Legion when he was in Ajaccio, so he explained, we call it the Creekwood Fortress. This is the fortress with the most Genoese garrisons, and it has been confronting the Northern Legion in Bastia. Lawrence nodded. As long as the enemy troops in this fortress can be attracted out of the city, and the Northern Legion can be retreated collectively, the Genoese will most likely take back Bastia and continue to push the front line forward, and then the withdrawal can be completed naturally. Is there any way to fight the enemy outside the fortress? Lawrence asked with a frown. Major Trifoli pondered for a moment and said, the enemy's fortress is strong and well supplied, so it is unlikely that they will take the initiative to attack. Unless what? Unless we deliberately reveal a huge flaw, but this is too risky. Really? Lawrence stared at the map, weighing the pros and cons. The two then discussed how to lure the Genoese army out of the fortress, but no matter what method was used, the conclusion was that it was almost impossible to do it with the strength of the 4th Battalion. The 4th Battalion had only more than 200 people, and the defenders in the Creekwood Fortress would not regard them as a threat. Even if they went out of the city to fight, they would only send a small-scale force, which would not reach the scale Lawrence wanted. It was already late at night, so Lawrence and Tripoli had to put away the map and prepare to discuss it again after returning to the camp tomorrow. The next morning, Lawrence and Tripoli sat up from the hard bedboard. Sleeping on this wooden board with only a layer of hay for a night really made Lawrence feel a little sore in the back. After simply packing up their belongings, the two were about to return to the camp on the outskirts of the city, but were suddenly stopped by a soldier on the street. Major Bonaparte, Major Tripoli, General Nathan requires you to go to the headquarters to see him immediately. The soldier saluted the two and said simply, a perfect version of the book in 1619. Lawrence narrowed his eyes and looked at Tripoli, not knowing what General Nathan wanted to do by suddenly summoning them. However, since it was an order from his superiors, the two had to turn around and go to Nathan's longhouse. When Lawrence saw General Nathan, he was sitting at the table with a serious face. The desk, which was usually piled with various documents, was very tidy at this moment, with only a flat piece of letter paper on the table. You are here, sit down. Nathan's eyes were still fixed on the letter, and he casually asked the two to sit down. Lawrence also keenly noticed that, although Nathan's words were very concise, his tone lacked some hostility towards him. Seeing the two of them sitting down, Nathan sighed slightly, pushed the letter on the table to Lawrence, and said, General Paula's order arrived this morning. Since Nathan took the initiative to push it to him, it meant that he had the right to know the content. Lawrence did not refuse, and directly picked up the letter and glanced at it. The content of the letter was very simple. Paulie asked Nathan to prepare for the withdrawal from Bastia within 3 days, including the transportation of weapons and equipment and supplies and the evacuation of civilians around Bastia. In addition, once the main force of Genoa marched towards Bastia, it was not allowed to fight, and it was necessary to take the initiative to give up Bastia. As far as I know, the parliament clearly rejected the motion to return the front line to the south. General Nathan held his chin with both hands and said in a low voice. Lawrence glanced at General Nathan's eyes and said, we can't let those good-for-nothings in the parliament decide the fate of Corsica. After seeing Paula's order, General Nathan must have guessed that Paulie wanted to force the army to withdraw. He had not revealed it to him before to prevent the news from leaking out. Now that the withdrawal plan was about to start, the Supreme Commander of the Northern Corps naturally could not be kept in the dark. This must be the implicit meaning of Paula's order. Chapter 41, Withdrawal, Part 2. After hearing this, General Nathan grinned and said, you hate those congressmen too? Great, at least we have something in common. I don't hate congressmen, I just think they should replace them with a group of people with real talents and knowledge. Lawrence frowned and added, besides, General, you summoned us not to get together and scold the congressman. Nathan restrained his expression and said very seriously, I might guess that you and General Paulie planned this withdrawal for a bigger plan. Lawrence nodded. This was not difficult to guess. He and Paulie certainly would not withdraw the troops without reason and violate the parliament, so he said, that's right, but I have no right to disclose it. I understand. For some reason, Nathan's temper today was much more restrained than in previous times, and his hostility towards Lawrence was also reduced a lot. Although I don't know what you are planning, I know that this is an action of great significance to Corsica. General Nathan suddenly said in a deep voice, I apologize for my previous impolite behavior, Major Bonaparte. I thought you got a military position by currying favor with General Paulie, but everything you did in the 4th Battalion made me think that you are a real soldier. After that, General Nathan took the initiative to stand up, stretched out his right hand, and said, for Corsica, we need to work together. Lawrence was silent for a moment. He absolutely did not believe that General Nathan had no grudges against him. He probably saw Paula's order and knew that he had to cooperate with him, so he took the initiative to shake hands and make peace. But no matter what, being able to get the assistance of the Northern Corps is undoubtedly a huge help for Lawrence. In addition, General Nathan is in a high position in the army. If he can win his support in the future, it will be of great benefit to Lawrence. For Corsica, Lawrence said seriously, and stood up and shook hands with General Nathan to make peace. The two men held their right hands tightly together, smiled at each other and nodded frequently. Although it was unknown how sincere each of them was in their smiles, this ceremony lasted for a full half minute. After sitting back in his chair, Lawrence spoke first. Since General Pauly has given the order, the withdrawal should be carried out immediately. Lawrence, like Pauly, knew that there was not much time left for Corsica. In addition, Lawrence, who was far away from Ajaccio, was worried that Ciro Russell would take the opportunity to target his subordinates, so he could not stay in Bastia for too long. General Nathan did not speak, but nodded in approval. This plan was very important to Pauly, and he could not afford to make any mistakes. Lawrence gave Trifle a look, indicating that he should explain the plan they discussed last night to Nathan. Because Lawrence had never been on the battlefield, he left the specific details to the two professional soldiers and just listened on the side. The two discussed for more than an hour, during which many of Lawrence's proposals were rejected in the discussion, but the way of thinking of the two experienced soldiers in the discussion also made Lawrence gain a lot. In the end, there were two plans that reached a consensus between the two. One is to let the Northern Corps launch a full-scale attack on the Riverwood fortress, deliberately make mistakes in the attack, and attract the Genoese army to take the initiative, to attack in a hurry. The second is to let a small force go deep into the depths alone, bypass the Riverwood fortress, to attack the supply line of the Genoese army, thereby attracting the enemy's pursuit, and lead the enemy to Bastia, which is no longer garrisoned, during the retreat. Lawrence looked at the map of Bastia. For these two plans, even he, an outsider, could see that the risk of the first one was too great. The Northern Corps and the defenders in the Riverwood fortress were only evenly matched. If the retreat is not timely, it is easy to result in heavy casualties, and then it will be playing with fire and getting burned. As for the second plan, which unit should be sent to risk life and death alone, the three of them already had the answer in their hearts. Major Bonaparte, what do you think? In the first plan, if something goes wrong, the Northern Army may even be wiped out. General Nathan habitually squinted at Lawrence and said, I don't know what he was thinking. At this point, Lawrence knew that there was no other choice. Since he had taken over the power in the army from Pauly, he naturally had his own obligations. I understand. The 4th Battalion will go deep into the rear of the Creekwood fortress, Lawrence said in a deep voice. Very good. General Nathan nodded with satisfaction. If the 4th Battalion was wiped out in the operation, there would be no substantial loss to the Northern Army. At that time, the responsibility could be shifted to Lawrence's command area. I will immediately start to withdraw most of the supplies from Bastia. I hope the 4th Battalion can start the operation within 2 days. General Nathan added, then carefully folded Paula's letter and put it away, indicating that Lawrence and Trifale could leave. After leaving the Longhouse, Lawrence and Trifale both looked extremely serious. They both knew that, although they were officers, they were also very likely to be captured, or even killed in this operation. When they returned to the camp of the 4th Battalion, it was already noon. Check out the correct version on the 16 to 9 book forum. Sir. Lieutenant Seth was much more alert this time. Seeing Lawrence from a distance, he quickly came forward to salute. How is the situation in the camp? Lawrence nodded in return and asked. Very good. Lieutenant Seth's face was full of uncontrollable excitement. He did not come to the 4th Battalion as a conscript, but was assigned here as a company commander from the regular army. In the past, Lieutenant Seth watched the 4th Battalion gradually degenerate into a gathering place for gangsters and ruffians, but he could do nothing about it. But now, since the arrival of Lawrence Bonaparte, it seems that everything has begun to move towards normality again. Sir, last night, about 10 people left the camp, and the rest have made up their minds to become real soldiers. Lieutenant Seth said excitedly. 10 people. Lawrence himself was a little surprised. He thought that a large number of soldiers who were accustomed to the lawless life would choose to leave. Thinking about it this way, it might be that his ruthlessness really frightened them, and the temptation of the 2 large boxes of gold coins made many people choose to follow him. Lieutenant, call everyone together. Just like last time, there are only 3 minutes. Yes. Only 1 day has passed, and the formation standing in front of Lawrence has changed from yesterday's loose semicircle to today's neat square. Everyone is dressed in uniform, and no one dares to slack off with a coat on their shoulders. Very good, Lieutenant. Lawrence estimated the time. Less than 2 minutes have passed, and the 4th Battalion has been assembled. Lieutenant Seth smiled bitterly and whispered, they are actually soldiers who have experienced war. As long as they can be made to obey, they will not be inferior to other troops. Lawrence nodded, took 2 steps forward, and accepted the attention of all the soldiers. Everyone's eyes were focused on Lawrence. Since they had given up leaving, it meant that they had already tied their fate closely to Lawrence. Glory and wealth. Can this young major really lead them to gain these? Thanks to Fushan Beiruameng, Male God, Brother Yang, and Brother Lizzie for their monthly ticket support. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42 Boost. My fellow soldiers, from today on, it is the first day that I will truly take over the 4th Battalion. Facing the expectant eyes of the crowd, Lawrence said loudly, according to the promise, the moment you decide to follow me, we will call each other brothers. I know that you have been regarded as rats in the sewers and parasites of the army by other troops, but from today on, all this is gone forever. Follow me. When you retire from the army, the wealth you have accumulated will be enough for you to enjoy your old age in Florence. Follow me. When you walk to the streets of Ajaccio, the Corsicans will entertain you, the war heroes, with flowers and sweet wine. As long as I, Napoleon Bonaparte, am still in this world, infinite glory and wealth will be in your hands. I will share everything we have with you infinitely and generously, and all of this only requires you to give one thing in return. Lawrence raised his arms and shouted, deliberately pausing for a few seconds. All the soldiers couldn't help but tiptoe, looking at Lawrence nervously and expectantly, waiting for him to tell the return he asked for. Loyalty. Apart from this, I have nothing else to ask for. The whole place was silent for a moment. Lawrence closed his eyes, clenched his right fist, and hammered his heart, waiting for the soldier's response. Soon, someone took the lead and imitated Lawrence, hammering his right hand on his heart, shouting, loyalty. This leading shout instantly ignited the passion of all the soldiers. Everyone stood up straight, exhausted the last bit of oxygen in their lungs and shouted, loyalty, loyalty, loyalty. The sound waves were higher and higher, and the birds in the woods were frightened, and flew away one after another. Lieutenant Seth also raised his arms, and shouted in the crowd. After being in the 4th Battalion for so long, this was the first time he felt that he had become a real soldier again. Although Major Trifali, who was standing behind Lawrence, did not join the fanatical soldiers, he looked at Lawrence with a little more admiration. He could finally understand what he saw that day, why the patrol team under Lawrence was so cohesive. Lawrence stretched out his hands and pressed down, signaling everyone to be quiet, and then said, I have heard the oath of each of you. Let God bear witness, only death can break the oath between brothers. There was a cheer in response from below. Lawrence waved his hands again, to signal everyone to be quiet, and took a few steps forward, getting closer to the soldiers, and said seriously, today, the 4th Battalion received an order for a special operation. We will fight deep behind the Genoese. We will not have any reinforcement and supplies, nor will we have any replacements or wounded. The soldiers couldn't help but be stunned. Their originally fanatical expressions faded slightly. In the face of the real danger of death, even the glory and wealth that Lawrence had just promised faded a bit. Major Trifali worriedly whispered in Lawrence's ear, saying this now will inevitably shake morale. Lawrence shook his head firmly, and responded in a low voice, they must be mentally prepared. Then, Lawrence looked at the soldiers who were somewhat retreating, and announced loudly, this is undoubtedly a life and death operation. Therefore, I declare that, when I die in battle, Major Trifali will take over command. When Major Trifali dies in battle, Lieutenant Seth will take over command. When Lieutenant Seth dies in battle, the surviving officer with the highest rank will take command. The soldiers couldn't help but look up at Lawrence, and couldn't help thinking, is this officer ready to die on the battlefield? Lawrence seemed to see through the soldiers' minds, and said excitedly, for the freedom and independence of Corsica, for your glory and wealth, I'm ready. At this point, even the most timid soldiers felt their blood boiling in their chests. Even his superiors have already made up their minds to stay on the battlefield forever, so what reason do he have to escape? I look forward to seeing the blood of the Corsicans on the battlefield. Now, everyone disband. Lawrence ordered. But the fanatical soldiers still stood there, looking at Lawrence with enthusiasm and admiration, until Lawrence and Tripoli called Lieutenant Seth to leave, and the soldiers dispersed in groups of 3 or 2. Lawrence and the other 2 came to the edge of the camp, and Lieutenant Seth was the first to speak excitedly. "Sir, I can't remember when the 4th Battalion last had such morale." Major Tripoli also nodded in agreement, and couldn't help but praise, "The speech is great, Major Bonaparte." Lawrence smiled bitterly and shook his head. He just understood that people's hearts are the greatest wealth. His unborn nephew was exiled in history, but he was supported by the soldiers to return to Paris from Toulon to be recrowned. This is the result of people's will. Now that he has established prestige among the soldiers, Lawrence will also start to bring the 4th Battalion back to normal. By the way, Major Cui Fally, you come and take over the 2nd Company temporarily. Lawrence ordered. Ever since the fat gambling dealer was shot that day, the position of the 2nd Company's commander has been vacant. Lawrence was not familiar with these soldiers, so he had to let the experienced Major Cui Fally take charge. After that, Lawrence also handed over the various chores and disciplines in the camp to the 2 company commanders. He was inexperienced and did not intend to do everything himself. Just as Lawrence was explaining the affairs to the 2 company commanders, a rustling sound came from the woods. A perfect version of the book in 1619. The 3 looked in the direction of the sound and saw that more than 20 service soldiers were pushing a flatbed cart towards the camp. Lawrence nodded. This should be the batch of supplies approved by General Nathan, so he took the initiative to step forward and confirm the handover with the leading officer. Lieutenant Seth's eyes widened. He walked around the flatbed trucks, picked up a brand new military jacket, and couldn't help but said in surprise, "Oh my god, sir, is this for the 4th Battalion? Is there any problem?" Lawrence asked back. "Of course not, of course." Lieutenant Seth seemed to remember something and said with a bitter face, "The 4th Battalion has not received supplies for a long time. As you can see, sir, everyone's clothes have been washed and turned white, but no one has changed them. The blankets are torn into rags, but they are still covered. The previous commanders also applied to the headquarters, but..." Lawrence nodded to show his understanding. Nathan definitely didn't want to waste resources on this group of waste in his eyes. "I said, all this is in the past. I will make the 4th Infantry Battalion a hero for the Corsicans, and no one will discriminate against us anymore." Lawrence patted Lieutenant Seth's shoulder and said earnestly, "Now, Lieutenant, distribute these things to every soldier, and store the extra ones temporarily. As for the muskets and ammunition, they need to be stored specially, and sent to be strictly guarded." "Understood." Lieutenant Seth saluted excitedly, and then found a few soldiers to move these supplies into the camp and start distributing them. After a while, even Lawrence and Tripoli, who were standing at the edge of the camp, could hear cheers coming from inside. "It's really strange." Major Tripoli listened to the cheers from the camp and said with a smile, "It's obvious that they were just given what they deserved." Lawrence looked at the camp, smiled and joked, "This is not simple. If I can distribute what everyone deserves to them, I can be an emperor. Maybe you can really do it. Who knows?" Chapter 43 Surprise Attack. 1768 was the 3rd day after General Nathan received Paula's order. Lawrence, who was in the 4th Battalion, also received General Nathan's order early in the morning. In a tent in the center of the camp, Lawrence, Tripoli and Lieutenant Seth were looking solemnly at a letter on the table, which was sent by General Nathan in the morning. The letter briefly explained to Lawrence the preparations for the evacuation of Bastia. Most of the supplies in the city had been transported back to the new station in the south, and even the military rations in Bastia were only kept for 10 days, so that they could evacuate at any time, after observing the Genoese army. At the end of the letter, General Nathan formally issued an order to the 4th Battalion to start the operation in the name of the Supreme Commander of the Northern Corps, indicating that Lawrence would set off this morning. The 3 of them read the letter carefully from top to bottom twice, and then Major Tripoli spread out the map on the table and explained to Lawrence, "The route we plan to march is to pass through the jungle to the west of the Creekwood Fortress, avoid the detection of the garrison in the fortress, and arrive here." Major Tripoli said, pointing his finger at a bay in the northeast of the fortress, and added, Yellowhorn Bay, this is a natural harbor. The Genoese supply fleet will stop here to unload and then transport it to the Creekwood fortress by land. In other words, there should be a large amount of supplies stored here. Lawrence nodded. Yes, if the Yellowhorn Bay is lost, the Genoese army will definitely not sit idly by. Major Tripoli continued to add. But, Lieutenant Set interrupted timidly, the defense of such an important place will definitely not be relaxed. With the military strength of our battalion, I'm afraid that. Lawrence also nodded in agreement. For such a supply center, even if it is located in the rear of the fortress, the Genoese army will not be stupid enough to be completely undefended. Fortunately, Major Tripoli also considered this point and answered confidently, according to the intelligence I received, the main force of the Genoese army is still stationed in the fortress. Even if the Sheephorn Bay is fortified, there will not be a large number of troops stationed there. Of course, given the current situation of our battalion, we may not even be able to deal with the small number of troops stationed there. Tripoli's words were not meant to undermine the morale of his own people, but he was also aware of the current situation of the 4th Battalion. There were only more than 120 muskets in the 200-man army. Fortunately, the remaining soldiers were not unarmed. At least everyone could be assigned a broad-bladed infantry sword. Considering these factors, Lawrence and Tripoli did not hope to use line tactics to fight the defenders of Sheephorn Bay, so there was only one tactic left. Surprise attack. Major Tripoli traced his planned marching route with his finger and said, most of this route is in the dense jungle far away from human habitation. The probability of being detected by the Genoese is extremely low. If we march all the way to the Gulf of Sheep in secret, and then launch an attack at night, and engage in hand-to-hand combat with the defenders, there is still a good chance. Lawrence himself was just an apprentice of war, so he looked at Lieutenant Set, and asked for his opinion with his eyes. This is indeed a good chance, but after we take the Gulf of Sheep and attract the main force of Genoa to pursue, how should we retreat? Lieutenant Set hesitated for a moment and asked. After the words came out, Lawrence and Tripoli looked at each other, and both of them looked at the map in silence for a long time. This is exactly the most difficult point of the whole plan. Although Lawrence is confident that he can attract the Genoese army to Bastia, how many soldiers of the 4th Battalion will be killed and injured afterwards? Even Lawrence is not willing to accept this consequence. Only God knows. Lawrence said casually, and Major Tripoli nodded in agreement. The 4th Battalion will face an enemy force that is several times larger than its own number, and is surrounded from the direction of retreat. How to break through, and what the price of breaking through will be, the three people present are currently unsure. With a slight sigh, Major Tripoli folded up the map, and put it away, then stood up and said, no matter what, we must set off now. Sheephorn Bay is more than 80 miles away from here. If we force march all day, we should be able to arrive at night. Lawrence nodded and looked at Lieutenant Set, and ordered, notify the soldiers to pack their bags, assemble in 5 minutes, distribute muskets and sabers, and then set off immediately. Yes. Although he was a little worried, Lieutenant Set still chose to believe Lawrence, and ran out of the tent in a hurry after a brief reply. Although the soldiers of the 4th Battalion had been depraved for a long time, they were experienced fighters who had been baptized by war. After Lawrence's order was issued, there was no need for additional instructions. The soldiers had already skillfully arranged their backpacks and sleeping bags and assembled. Without too much mobilization, Lawrence believed that these soldiers had been mentally prepared 3 days ago, so he ordered them to set off directly after a simple head count. According to Major Tripoli's plan, the 4th Battalion needed to shuttle through the jungle non-stop to reach Sheephorn Bay at midnight. During this period, they had to be careful and cautious to guard against possible Genoa sentries and local villagers or hunters. During the intense march, there was not even a reserved lunch time. The soldiers had to step through the dense bushes while stuffing their mouths with dry bread that was as hard as stone, without even a sip of light soup. However, when the soldiers saw that the two officers, Lawrence and Tripoli, were chewing the dry black bread with difficulty like them, they had no complaints. Fortunately, the route planned by Major Cui Fally was indeed hidden. At most, they encountered a few squirrels and hares along the way, but no one else noticed it. Check out the correct version on the 16:9 book forum. At midnight, Lawrence looked up at the weather. There was no wind tonight and the sky was overcast. Visibility was very low. The moon was wrapped in layers of dark clouds and only had a hazy halo. The 4th Battalion was still hidden in the woods at this moment, but faint lights could be seen not far away. Major CUI Fally took out a silver pocket watch, took a look, pointed at the lights in the distance, and whispered to Lawrence, "It's midnight now, and it's about the same as expected. That's the dock of Yangjiao Bay." Lawrence squinted his eyes and looked at Yangjiao Bay, but he could only see a few spots of light. The distance was still a little too far to see the specific situation on the dock. So Lawrence turned to Lieutenant Set and ordered, "Send 2 people with good eyesight, wrap their bodies in black blankets, and go to find out the situation inside. If they are discovered, let them fire a gun to signal. In addition, let the other soldiers rest on the spot for a while." Major Trifoli looked at Lawrence in surprise. This young major had only been in the barracks for a few days, but the series of orders he issued were very rigorous and correct. While waiting for the scouts to return, Lawrence also chatted with Trifoli in a low voice. "So far, it has been smooth, but if I were in command of the Genoese army, I would definitely set up a scout post in this woods." Major Trifoli smiled bitterly and said, "I don't think it's necessary. In front of Sheephorn Bay is the Creekwood Fortress. Even if the enemy occupies Sheephorn Bay, it will be difficult to escape the pursuit of the defenders in the fortress. Just like us now." Lawrence exhaled a long breath and said with a smile, "Chapter 44 Attack." About half an hour later, the 2 spies sent by Lawrence returned successfully. This also made Lawrence feel a little relieved. If these 2 people were discovered by the defenders of Yangjiao Bay, he would have no choice but to attack or retreat temporarily. "Sir, Yangjiao Bay is arranged like this." One of them squatted on the ground and used a branch to draw the general situation in Yangjiao Bay. Lawrence turned his head and asked Lieutenant Seth to bring an oil lamp, and then listened in the dim light. "The only way to enter the dock is a small path with steep cliffs on both sides. Only about 10 people can walk side by side. The main building of the dock is a large warehouse, and there are several 2-story wooden houses, which are probably the residences of the defenders there. We estimated that the defenders will not exceed 200 people. No more than 200 people." Major CUI Faller's eyes lit up. If this is the case, the 4th Battalion, which has the advantage of surprise attack, has a good chance of taking Yangjiao Bay. "That's right, but," the spy hesitated for a moment and said, "but among those wooden houses, there is a long house made of bricks and tiles, and the guards there are very strict. And the guards there don't look like Genoese soldiers." Lawrence frowned and asked, "What are they dressed like?" "You can barely see that they are wearing breastplates, with pointed helmets on their heads and halberds in their hands. By the way, there seems to be a white cross on a red background in front of the breastplate." Lawrence and Trifle looked at each other. They were both familiar with the white cross on a red background, and they said at the same time, "Swiss mercenary halberd soldiers?" Swiss mercenaries were absolutely famous throughout Europe from the 15th to the 18th century. Because Switzerland is mostly rugged mountains and the area of farmland is scarce, quite a number of Swiss people chose to take up arms and go abroad. Even the Pope of Rome and the King of France had formed Swiss legions. In the 7 Years' War that ended 5 years ago, the Swiss Legion of France played an indelible role. Even in the Vatican of later times, the Holy See was guarded by a Swiss halberd guard of about 150 people. As a commercial republic with a shortage of manpower, it was not surprising that Genoa incorporated mercenaries into the army, but what surprised Lawrence was why there were Swiss mercenaries guarding the house. You know, behind the excellent combat power of Swiss mercenaries is their high price. The wallets of ordinary people are not rich enough to let these elite guards guard themselves. Maybe this is an opportunity for the 4th Battalion. Lawrence stared at the diagram on the ground and whispered. Major CUI Fally was stunned for a moment and asked, "What do you mean? What opportunity?" Lawrence did not look up and replied, "Even our General Pauly is not rich enough to hire a Swiss guard to protect himself." "Are you saying that there is a big shot inside?" Major CUI Fally nodded in understanding and said excitedly. Lawrence turned to look at Lieutenant Set. "Lieutenant, tell all soldiers to get ready. Let the soldiers with knives launch an attack on the Sheephorn Bay, and those on the list should be at the front." Soldiers with muskets line up and follow Major Trifoli, temporarily hiding at the entrance of the Sheephorn Bay. About 3 minutes later, more than 100 soldiers drew their sabers and moved towards the Sheephorn Bay under the cover of night. In order to stabilize morale, Lawrence decided to take the risk himself, personally draw his sword, and follow these soldiers into the interior of the Sheephorn Bay. Trifoli and Lieutenant Set led the musketeers to keep a certain distance from them and followed closely behind. What is this? A small group of Genoese patrolmen holding torches ran into the soldiers of the 4th Battalion who broke in from the entrance path. Everyone charge! Lawrence shouted, leading the way and rushing towards these patrolmen with a dagger in hand. Alarm bell. Go and ring the alarm bell. A Genoese soldier who looked like a captain shouted at the soldiers at the end of the team and then quickly drew out his saber to deal with the soldiers of the 4th Battalion who rushed up. The other Genoese also hurriedly attached bayonets to their muskets and retreated under the charge of the 4th Battalion soldiers. Due to the huge difference in numbers, only half a minute later, the patrol team had all fallen in a pool of blood. At the same time, a loud and clear bell sound came from the dock. Don't relax. While the enemy has not reacted, start fighting freely now. Lawrence ordered loudly and wiped his forehead covered with blood. This was the blood that splashed on his head after a Genoese soldier was pierced through the heart by Lawrence. With the lights on the dock, Lawrence could see the defenders pouring out of the residences one after another. Most of them were holding muskets and didn't even have time to attach bayonets. They had to wave their muskets like fire sticks to resist the soldiers of the 4th Battalion. In such a big melee, the broadswords used by the soldiers of the 4th Battalion were more advantageous than the smoothbore muskets with bayonets. In addition, the defenders were not prepared at all. They rushed to fight in a hurry and had to retreat step by step. However, Lawrence's expression was still serious. After he ordered the free battle, he did not join the battlefield in person, but climbed up a small earthen slope and looked down at the longhouse, guarded by Swiss mercenaries. Although the defenders of Yangjiao Bay were already in chaos, Lawrence was still keenly aware that the guards in the longhouse did not make any movement, as if they did not obey the command of the defenders of Yangjiao Bay. It's interesting. Who is the master inside? Lawrence squinted his eyes and continued to observe the battle situation below, ready to issue further instructions at any time. A correct version of the book in 16:9. Finally, just when the defenders of Yangjiao Bay were on the verge of collapse, the guards in the longhouse took action. Dozens of well-trained guards armed with halberds rushed out of the door. As soon as they left the longhouse, they skillfully arranged themselves into a 3-row square formation. With the light of the torches in Sheephorn Bay, Lawrence could barely see that the guards' breastplates were indeed marked with the Swiss flag, and there were about 50 of them. Lawrence stared at the situation on the battlefield. The moment the guards came out together, he ordered without hesitation, 4th Battalion, everyone retreat. The soldiers who heard Lawrence's order also repeated the order to retreat loudly to ensure that every soldier on the battlefield could hear it. For these elite mercenaries, Lawrence did not expect the knife-wielding infantry of the 4th Battalion to be able to deal with them. Even under their tight halberd square formation, the soldiers of the 4th Battalion could not even get close to them. The soldiers who heard the retreat order took a deep breath, increased their strength to swing their swords, to break free from the opponents in front of them, and then retreated to the entrance. At this time, even Lawrence, who was watching the battle from a distance, could hear an angry roar coming from the longhouse, which seemed to ask the mercenaries to cooperate with the remaining defenders to pursue. The mercenaries who had already gathered did not hesitate. After receiving the order, they trotted towards the 4th Battalion that was evacuating to the entrance. Lawrence retreated towards the entrance with the soldiers of the 4th Battalion, while looking back to confirm that the mercenaries were really chasing. Seeing that the neatly arranged figures not far away were still approaching him, Lawrence couldn't help but curl up the corners of his mouth. After all, on the narrow path at the entrance, there was a big surprise waiting for these pursuers. Chapter 45, Surprise. Major Bonaparte, what's going on? Major Trifoli asked when he saw Lawrence and the first wave of attacking soldiers return to the entrance. They've taken the bait. Lawrence answered simply, and then ordered the musketeers, everyone line up in 3 rows, the front row squats, and listen to the order to shoot. The soldiers of the 4th Battalion, except for those who were killed in battle or seriously injured and could not retreat, had all returned to the entrance. At the same time, in this small path with cliffs on both sides, the neat footsteps of the pursuers and the echoes getting closer and closer could be heard. Everyone's heart was in their throat. The footsteps were getting closer and closer, and even the shadows of the long halberds in the hands of the Swiss mercenaries could be seen at the corner. Just as the mercenaries turned the corner and faced the soldiers of the 4th Battalion, Lawrence made a prompt decision. First row. Shoot. Without giving the other side any time to react, as a puff of gunpowder rose, 1/3 of the mercenaries in the first row had fallen, and the rest were not fatally injured because of the protection of the breastplate. Damn, this equipment is really sophisticated. Lawrence couldn't help but curl his lips. In his original expectation, shooting on such a narrow road, even a smoothbore musket should have a good hit rate, and one round of shooting can knock down at least 2/3 of a row of mercenaries. Second row shooting. The first and third rows exchange positions to reload, and the third row obeys the order to shoot. Lawrence continued to order. Considering the thick armor of these mercenaries, in order to prevent them from charging at the musketeers during the intervals of firepower output, Lawrence adopted a 3-stage shooting tactic to output continuous firepower. Soon, in 3 rounds of shooting, the Swiss mercenaries' advance was greatly hindered, and at least more than 20 people fell to the ground due to injuries or death. After 3 rounds of shooting, although Lawrence had ordered to reload, there was still a gap before the musketeers who fired the first shot finished reloading. The mercenaries would not miss this gap, and quickened their pace to charge towards the 4th Battalion. Put on the bayonets. Those holding knives should be at the front and engage in hand-to-hand combat. Lawrence drew out his short knife and pointed at the invading mercenaries and ordered. In such a narrow space, it is difficult for the halberd soldiers to fully exert their advantages because the halberd's chopping function is almost non-existent, and if it is used as a spear, its weight is much higher than that of an ordinary spear, which is not convenient to use. This is why Lawrence deliberately asked the soldiers holding knives to engage in hand-to-hand combat in the front row. After being close, the broadswords in the hands of the soldiers of the 4th Battalion are undoubtedly more flexible weapons. In a bloody battle that lasted more than 10 minutes, the entire narrow road echoed with the sound of steel-interlaced collisions and soldiers wailing and shouting. Until the Swiss mercenaries retreated backwards, this path of only a few dozen meters was already covered with blood. Those who can still fight, follow me to continue the pursuit. Lieutenant, you take a few people to stay and help the wounded. Seeing that the mercenaries had begun to retreat, Lawrence hurriedly ordered Lieutenant Set, and then personally joined the pursuit. These soldiers had simple bandages in their backpacks. Although these treatments were futile for the seriously injured, they could still save some soldiers from the brink of death. The retreating Swiss mercenaries were gathering towards the longhouse they were guarding, while Lawrence and Trefali led their men to chase them relentlessly. After the bloody battle just now, there were only a dozen mercenaries left, but more than 30 soldiers of the 4th Battalion were seriously injured. This was a near 1-to-1 casualty ratio, and it was the result of the 4th Battalion's advantages in terrain, weapons, and numbers. Outside the longhouse in Sheephorn Bay, Lawrence had led his men to surround the entire house and ordered the musketeers to load ammunition and be ready to fight again at any time. As for the defenders of Sheephorn Bay, their morale had long been so low that they were scattered everywhere. When they saw the soldiers of the 4th Battalion coming to chase them, they immediately had no intention of resisting. They either dropped their weapons and ran away, or knelt down and begged for mercy. Lawrence also unceremoniously assigned people to capture these surrendered soldiers. Even so, the dozen mercenaries who retreated to the longhouse were still a problem. If they resisted to the end, it might take another bloody battle to completely capture them. In this way, persuading them to surrender was the best option. I'm Major Napoleon Bonaparte, the commander of the 4th Battalion of the Corsica National Defense Force. You have no chance of escape. If you surrender voluntarily, I promise to save your lives. Lawrence shouted into the longhouse. It was not until 5 or 6 minutes later that the window of the longhouse was opened, and then a long halberd tied with white cloth was extended to indicate that they accepted the surrender. Lawrence also breathed a sigh of relief. It was the best result to avoid unnecessary casualties. Then, the door of the house was opened from the inside, and the mercenaries had thrown the long halberd aside, and came out with bare hands, surrounding a middle-aged man. The middle-aged man was wearing a shirt, and was a little fat. His big belly exceeded the restraint of the belt. Although he had surrendered to Lawrence, his eyes were still looking at Lawrence without any concealment, just like a superior. Before Lawrence could speak, he took the lead and said, "Major Bonaparte, I hope you can keep your promise. My family and my country are happy to pay a large ransom for my life." His voice was very steady, and it did not change at all, because of the current situation. Check out the correct version in 1619 book bar. Lawrence smiled and nodded, turned his head, and ordered Major Trefali, "Major, you take people to tie up all the prisoners of war, and go to their warehouse to see if there are any good things. Oh, this house must also be searched thoroughly," Lawrence said, pointing to the long house in front of him, and then said to the middle-aged man, "As for you, let's chat. I like to chat while walking." The man nodded silently, and followed Lawrence's pace. "Then, you should introduce yourself," Lawrence said. The man looked at the road ahead, and said in a deep voice, "Tiro Berlin, the general of the Republic of Genoa." Tiro Berlin! Exclamation mark. Lawrence felt that he had heard this name somewhere, and after a little thought, he remembered it. So Lawrence couldn't help but look at General Berlin in surprise and said, "I have heard of this name, the supreme commander of the Genoese army in Corsica. I thought you had been staying in the Creekwood fortress." "It's just to inspect the Bay of Sheep," General Berlin replied calmly. "How did the Corsican army get this news?" "In order to avoid being noticed, I only brought those Swiss guards on this trip. I said it was the favor of the goddess of luck. Would you believe it?" Lawrence shook his head and smiled. He did not expect that this big man who was temporarily staying in the Bay of Sheep would be the supreme commander of the entire Genoese army. General Berlin glanced at Lawrence and said, "But I admire your courage very much. The defenders of Riverwood Fortress will come to pursue you at the earliest at dawn. You can't run back to Bastia with these prisoners and wounded." Lawrence chuckled twice, then stared into General Berlin's eyes and said softly, "I thought so too, but after meeting the general, I no longer think so." Thanks to the book Friends Total War, Warhammer and Floating Life and 8 Dreams for their monthly tickets. Chapter 46 Harvest. "Really?" General Berlin frowned, his eyes drooped, and he couldn't help but sigh. He had almost guessed what Lawrence was going to do. "Well, I hope you can keep your promise." General Berlin fell silent after saying that, slowing down his pace, indicating that he didn't want to communicate with Lawrence anymore. Lawrence then called 2 soldiers and asked them to take General Berlin away, and at the same time, asked them to treat General Berlin as best as possible as a prisoner of war. Then Lawrence sat on the steps in front of the long house waiting for Major Trefali to come and report. About half an hour later, Major Trefali, with an irrepressible smile, trotted all the way to Lawrence and said excitedly, "Major Bonaparte, I suggest you come to the warehouse in person to see it." Lawrence stood up in confusion, patted the dust on his butt, and followed Major Trefali to the warehouse in Sheephorn Bay. This warehouse is a large wooden and iron warehouse, several times larger than the warehouse of the Sea Snake Gang that Lawrence saw that day. All the materials transported from Genoa to the Riverwood Fortress were transferred here, so half of the area of this huge warehouse was filled with various wooden boxes and cloth bags. "What's in here?" Lawrence took a few glances and asked trifle. "Too many. Muskets, gunpowder, lead bullets, cotton armor, flour, wheat, rum, gin, bandages and gauze, and even a few deposit slips from the Bank of Venice." Major Trifle pointed at the goods excitedly and said that basically everything an army needed for life, fighting, and entertainment could be found here. Lawrence couldn't help but roll his eyes at him and reminded him, "Don't be too excited, we can't take these things away." Major Trifle was stunned for a moment, sobered up a little, and then propped up his chin and looked at the mountain of gold in front of him with a bitter face. Lawrence walked to the area where the munitions were stored, picked up a Genoa musket, and looked at it for a while. The inscriptions on these muskets showed that these guns were basically made by craftsmen in the German region, and they should be large-scale custom-made products from Genoa. "I've seen these muskets. They are much better than the ones in our 4th Battalion." Look, the stocks are coated with the best wood wax oil, and the bayonets of these guns are all sleeve type, unlike our muskets which have inserted bayonets. Trifoli saw Lawrence looking at the muskets, so he stepped forward to explain to him. Good stuff, we'll distribute them to everyone in a while. Lawrence couldn't help but nod with satisfaction, then put the musket back in place, and then turned to look at other military equipment. Just from what Lawrence saw, those sabers, dome helmets, cotton armor, and military boots were much better than the old styles currently equipped by the 4th Battalion, so he took these equipment for himself without hesitation, and asked Trifoli to be responsible for replacing the soldiers with new equipment in a while. As for the several deposit slips of the Bank of Venice mentioned by Major Trifoli just now, they were also sent to Lawrence. These bearer deposit slips were considered hard currency in most of Europe, since the gold content of the Dakar gold coins issued by Venice is as high as 99.5%. Merchants from all countries will welcome these currencies that are almost equivalent to gold. After a simple glance at the numbers above, Lawrence couldn't calculate how many Corsican gold coins these deposit slips were worth, so he had to fold them up and put them in his pocket, and then find a way to ask Grosso to find a way to sell them later. Lawrence then went to the area where daily necessities were stored and took a few glances. He ordered Major Trifoli to send someone to distribute the soft wheat bread to the soldiers. The soldiers of the 4th Battalion had marched all day and only ate a few pieces of dry and hard black bread at noon. As for those strong liquors, Lawrence thought for a moment and decided to distribute a bottle to each soldier as a trophy, but they were only allowed to be placed in backpacks and not to get a drop of alcohol in this operation. After Lawrence had almost walked around the entire warehouse, Lieutenant Set came to Lawrence with a heavy face to report, "Sir, the wounded have been basically dealt with." Lawrence glanced at Lieutenant Set's gloomy face and asked seriously, "What's the situation?" A total of more than 40 brothers were injured, half of whom have. Alas, it will be difficult for the rest to fight. Lieutenant Set sighed and answered in a low voice, "Sacrifice is inevitable. Lieutenant, record the names of all the fallen soldiers and ask them if they have any relatives after returning to the rear. In addition, since they died here, bury them in this sheephorn bay." Lawrence couldn't help sighing, patted Lieutenant Set on the shoulder and ordered. These soldiers who were determined to follow him died on the first day of the expedition, which really made Lawrence a little sad. Without giving Lawrence too much time to feel sad, Major Trifle soon found Lawrence with a serious expression and a black covered book. "Major Bonaparte, we found this when we were searching the Longhouse. I believe you will be very interested," Major Trifoli said, handing the book to Lawrence. Lawrence took the book and took a look. There was no pattern or decoration on the cover. It was just a cover made of tough buffalo leather. It looked like someone's notes. After flipping through it for a few times, Lawrence was sure that this was General Berlin's notes, which was equivalent to a memorandum, recording a lot of confidential information about the Genoese army. A correct version can be found in the 16-9 book forum. Not bad. General Nathan will like this, Lawrence said casually, and was about to close the book when he was interrupted by Major Trifoli. No, Major Bonaparte, look here." Major Trifoli walked forward solemnly and helped Lawrence turn the notes to the records of the most recent period, and several records instantly attracted Lawrence's attention. In August 1767, the war with the Corsicans was completely at a disadvantage, but perhaps we should keep in touch with that Ajaccio man. If there really comes a day of counterattack, his forces will definitely be helpful. On January 22nd, that disgusting Ajaccio man sent a letter requesting a new batch of supplies. Considering the need for his influence and intelligence in the western part of Ajaccio, I approved the request. On February 4th, the Ajaccio man said that there have been some troubles in the western part of the city recently, and that slaves cannot be provided for the time being. This is nonsense. I have to consider stopping my funding to him. The Ajaccio man, who has influence and intelligence networks in the western part of the city, encountered some troubles in early February. Lawrence narrowed his eyes, ran his finger across the lines of text, and read them carefully several times. He really didn't expect that he would be involved here. As for who this Ajaccio man was, it was self-evident to both him and Major Trifoli. "How about it, Major Bonaparte? Your big trouble in Ajaccio is finally solved," Major Trifoli said with a smile. having an affair with the Genoese, and being suspected of slave trading. No matter which one, it is a capital crime in Corsica. Lawrence was not excited, but just smiled and shook his head, saying, "These alone are not enough, but I have opened a breakthrough." As he said, Lawrence carefully put the notes into his backpack, then looked back in the direction of Ajaccio, and couldn't help muttering to himself, "Ciro Russell, it seems that the day I send you to hell is really not far away." Chapter 47 Design. After finishing all the affairs in Sheephorn Bay, it was close to 3 AM. The soldiers of the 4th Battalion had been marching all day and had just experienced a bloody battle, so Lawrence ordered everyone to rest on the spot. Sheephorn Bay had only one narrow entrance and exit, and Lawrence was sure that no defenders would escape during the attack, so he was not worried that someone would escape to Creekwood Fortress to tip off. Of course, by the early morning of the next day, the garrison of Creekwood Fortress would definitely notice something was wrong, so Lawrence had to prepare to retreat at dawn. The soldiers of the 4th Battalion did not have much time to rest, but after winning this first victory and sharing their spoils, everyone had no complaints on their faces, and they covered themselves with blankets and began to sleep soundly. Lawrence had fought with the soldiers all day, so he was naturally very tired, but before he fell asleep, there was one important thing he needed to figure out. "General Berlin, I'm sorry to disturb your rest again." Lawrence sent someone to bring General Berlin to him, and personally untied his tied hands. "As a prisoner of war, I don't expect to have enough rest." General Berlin rubbed his bloodshot eyes and said indifferently, "This." Lawrence took out the notebook, shook it in front of General Berlin, and said, "I'm a little concerned about a few records in it." General Berlin was silent for a while, lowered his head and asked, "Which ones?" "About the Ajaccio man, written in it HMM." General Berlin suddenly raised his head, looked at Lawrence, and said with a look of sudden enlightenment, "So that's it. Lawrence Bonaparte, I remember this name. Ciro Russell mentioned you to me, and you caused him a lot of trouble. So this Ajaccio man is confirmed to be Ciro Russell after your accusation?" Lawrence stuffed the notebook back into his bag and asked, "That's right." General Berlin nodded and admitted, and then added, "However, since you are still a polite young man, I will give you a friendly reminder. Pasquale Paoli is definitely aware of these things. If you want to overthrow Ciro Russell with this notebook, it is far from enough." "Thank you for your reminder," Lawrence said with a smile. Although he had guessed that Governor Paoli would definitely turn a blind eye to these things when he got the notebook, it was probably because Ciro had a good grasp of the degree and did not cross Paul's bottom line. Ciro must not have the courage to reveal some confidential information in the governor's palace to the Genoese. "So, you just want to ask these?" General Berlin frowned and asked. He believed that with Lawrence's intelligence, it was impossible for him not to guess that the Ajaccio man was Ciro Russell. "There is one more thing, or a request. I hope you can write a letter for me." General Berlin's face changed slightly, and he understood after a little thought. "Written to Ciro Russell, right?" Lawrence also noticed his reluctance from General Berlin's face, so he smiled and said, "If you agree, I can use a top secret intelligence in exchange." Before General Berlin considered whether to agree, Lawrence had already spoken out his so-called intelligence. "Currently, the garrison in Bastia is very empty. As long as the Genoese army launches an attack, it will be easy to force the Corsican army to retreat to the south. General Berlin's eyes widened. He really couldn't believe that Lawrence actually revealed such important intelligence. If this intelligence is true, it is a godsend for the Genoese army. Lawrence remained calm on the surface, but after seeing General Berlin's reaction, he couldn't help but secretly rejoice. He deliberately revealed the situation in Bastia to General Berlin to attract the attack of the Genoese army. This was Lawrence's plan. On the surface, this was a deal between Lawrence and General Berlin, but in fact, the chips on both ends of the scale were in Lawrence's plan. It was just that Lawrence said the news so easily, which made General Berlin a little suspicious. "I swear on the honor of the Bonaparte family that this information is absolutely true." Seeing that General Berlin was still hesitant, Lawrence also directly brought out his noble status to swear. Lawrence looked at General Berlin firmly with his eyes and put his right hand on his chest, indicating that his words were absolutely true. Although General Berlin was still a little skeptical, he still kept this information in mind silently, preparing to send someone to verify the truth after being released. "Well, tell me, what do you want me to write?" General Berlin sighed. Since he had learned Lawrence's information, plus his status as a prisoner, he had to agree to Lawrence's request. Although Lawrence knew that General Berlin would not completely believe his words, he knew that he would not ignore the news. Once he sent someone to find out the truth about Bastia, he would soon be able to prove the accuracy of the news. Read the correct version in the 16:9 book bar. Lawrence smiled and helped General Berlin back to his longhouse, found the letter paper and pen and ink, and Lawrence dictated the letter, while General Berlin wrote it. At the end of the letter, according to Lawrence's request, General Berlin also engraved his personal seal on it. "Thank you for your cooperation. You can go back and rest." Lawrence took the letter paper, blew the ink on it dry, and waved to signal 2 soldiers to take General Berlin back. Berlin's notes plus this letter. "Ciro Russell, I'm already looking forward to your death." Lawrence read the letter paper again with a cold look, and couldn't help muttering to himself. At 7 o'clock in the morning, all the soldiers of the 4th Battalion had gotten up and assembled. Although they only rested for 3 or 4 hours after a day of hard work, the soldiers were still energetic in such an intense operation. Lawrence couldn't help yawning. His rest time was even less than that of these soldiers, but he had to force himself to hold back his sleepiness, and began to order today's operations. "Major Trifoli, distribute the wheat bread, air-dried meat and butter in the warehouse. Breakfast is only half an hour." "Understood." Major Trifoli was directing the soldiers in the warehouse to distribute food, and he sighed as he looked at the piles of supplies. "It's a pity that so many things can't be taken away." Major Trifoli, who was originally a quartermaster, was very jealous of this treasure-like warehouse, and was reluctant to leave. Lawrence took a look at the warehouse, but he didn't feel like lingering. The weapons and armor that should be taken have been replaced by the soldiers of the 4th Battalion. As for other daily necessities, the soldiers have been ordered to carry as much as possible with them. "It's a pity to leave so many supplies here." Lawrence stroked his chin and followed Major Trifol's words. "Alas, there is no other way. Unless we dispatch 2 3-masted sailing ships now, we can move all these things away. But there is a way to make the best use of them." "Oh, how to do it?" Major Trifol asked with interest. "Burn them all." Chapter 48 Hostage. 1768, in the Riverwood Fortress in the north of Bastia, Colonel Quinault stood on the balcony of the main building of the castle, leisurely holding up the white porcelain teacup and sipping a sip of black tea. General Berlin was leaving the fortress yesterday to inspect the Bay of Sheephorn, so he temporarily handed over the affairs of the fortress and the temporary command of the army to Colonel Quinault. However, Colonel Quinault did not feel any pressure at all. The Genoese and Corsican armies had been confronting each other for quite a long time, and neither side had the strength to completely defeat the other. Especially this Riverwood fortress, which was originally built by a Corsican count in the Middle Ages. It was reinforced many times by the Genoese army in the war with the Corsicans. In addition to the garrison of nearly 3,000 people and the continuous supply from the rear, Colonel Quinault said that he could guard the city wall until he died of old age. This allowed Colonel Quinault to sleep leisurely until he woke up naturally, and then drink tea and watch the sun rise on the balcony in his pajamas. With the strength of the Corsican Northern Corps, which did not even have a few 12-pound cannons, it was a pipe dream to attack the Creekwood fortress. Ah, the rising sun in the endless sea, so beautiful, I should write a poem. Just as Colonel Quinault was intoxicated by the beautiful scenery before his eyes, a Genoese guard hurriedly ran into the balcony, saluted briefly and said, "Colonel, there is something going on." Colonel Quinault put the white porcelain cup on the small round table beside him with a little impatience, but he was still thinking about his own poem in his head, and asked casually, "What happened?" "General Belrin is expected to return to the fortress at 8 o'clock this morning, but it is already 8:30 now, and General Belrin and his party have not been seen in the surrounding area from the observation deck." Colonel Quinault turned his head to look at the guard, waved his hand impatiently and said, "It's nothing more than General Belrin was delayed there. Okay, go out. Don't interfere with me watching the sun cough. I mean, observing the enemy situation." Hearing the news that General Belrin had not returned, Colonel Quinault was actually a little happy. After all, if General Belron was in the fortress, he would not dare to enjoy leisurely life so blatantly. However, when Colonel Kinno picked up the teacup and looked back at the scenery outside the balcony, he no longer had any leisure and elegance in his mind. He heard a loud explosion from the direction of Yangjiao Bay, as if dozens of cannons were firing at the same time, followed by thick black smoke rising slowly from the bay. Clang! The teacup in Colonel Kinno's hand fell to the ground without any hindrance, and broke into several pieces, but both he and the guards were just staring at the black smoke rising from Yangjiao Bay in amazement. A fire? Impossible. Damn, it's an enemy attack. Although Colonel Kinno likes to slack off, he still showed the qualities of an experienced soldier at this critical moment. With the strength of the Corsican navy, the Bay of Sheephorn cannot be attacked from the sea. If it is a surprise attack bypassing the Creekwood fortress, the enemy's troops will not be too many, otherwise it will definitely be discovered. After a brief analysis, Colonel Kinno hurried into his bedroom to change into his military uniform and ordered the guard just now, quick, notify the 1st and 2nd Infantry Battalions to assemble quickly. At the same time, the soldiers of the 4th Battalion and the Bay of Sheephorn. TSK, what a pity. Major Trifoli said distressedly as he looked at the warehouse burning with a raging fire. He had just set fire to this treasure house with his own hands. There was a lot of gunpowder stored in the warehouse, plus flour, wheat and other flammable materials. Lawrence ordered the soldiers to place these explosive materials evenly, and then Major Trifoli stood in the distance and used a long rope as a fuse to ignite the entire warehouse. The destruction of things is sometimes more valuable than their existence. Right, General Belland? Lawrence said with a smile, looking at General Belland. General Belland had his hands tied behind his back and remained silent. He looked at the warehouse that was gradually reduced to ashes expressionlessly, wondering what he was thinking. Let's go, retreat to Bastia. Seeing that the fire gradually engulfed the warehouse and quickly spread to the entire Sheephorn Bay under the sea breeze, Lawrence also ordered the soldiers who had already assembled to begin retreating. There were more than 100 prisoners of war accompanying the soldiers of the 4th Battalion, who were placed in the center of the team by Lawrence to prevent them from resisting or escaping. Of course, the most important General Belland followed closely behind Lawrence. Unlike when they retreated this time, Lawrence deliberately led the soldiers to walk on the avenue to attract the attention of the Genoese army. On the other side, Colonel Kinno was anxiously leading 2 fully staffed infantry battalions towards the direction of Sheephorn Bay. General Berlin had handed over the command to him before he left. Now that such an incident had occurred in Sheephorn Bay, if the responsibility was to be investigated, Colonel Kinno would certainly not escape the blame. Now Colonel Kinno could only try to make amends and quickly find out what had happened in Sheephorn Bay and what had happened to General Berlin. Sir. A scout on horseback galloped to the side of Colonel Kinno and quickly reported, about 500 meters ahead, we found a troop with more than 300 people, but there should be only about 200 soldiers fighting. Sure enough, Colonel Kinno gritted his teeth after hearing this, confirmed his guess, and then asked, is it the Corsican army? The scout hesitated for a while and said, their military uniforms are from the Corsican army, but the muskets, swords, helmets, and armor are all our styles. Colonel Kinno almost fainted when he heard this. The other party obviously took the equipment in Sheephorn Bay for themselves. Have you seen General Belland? Check out the correct version in the 1619 book forum. There's no time to look carefully in such a hurry. Arsehole. Pass my order. The 1st Battalion will line up and follow me. The 2nd Battalion will split into 2 teams and surround the enemy from the flank. Colonel Kinno's troops soon met the soldiers of the 4th Battalion. Due to the poor accuracy of the smoothbore rifles, the distance between the two sides in the line tactics was only tens of meters, or even closer, which allowed Colonel Kinno to clearly see the commander of the other side. Sir, you have been surrounded, and there will be reinforcement coming from the Creekwood fortress. Colonel Kinno looked at Lawrence with a bad face and said in a deep voice. Lawrence looked around and estimated that the other side probably brought 2 battalions of troops. Seeing that Lawrence didn't say a word, Colonel Kinno didn't want to waste time talking. Anyway, he had an overwhelming force, so he ordered the 1st Battalion, load, aim, wait. Lawrence shouted, and then took a few steps forward. completely exposed to the muzzle of the other side. "Oh, are you ready to surrender?" Colonel Kino looked at Lawrence teasingly, and in his mind he had already started planning to hang this damned yellow-haired boy on the wall of the Creekwood Fortress as a warning to the public. Lawrence chuckled and shook his head, and gestured to Major Trifoli behind him. Major Trifoli also understood and brought General Berlin, whose hands were tied behind his back, to Lawrence. Before Colonel Kino could react, Lawrence directly grabbed General Berlin's neck with his backhand and pulled him in front of him and drew out a short knife with his right hand and held it under Berlin's neck. "General Berlin, you." Colonel Kino's eyes were about to pop out and the playful expression just now was swept away. He hurriedly waved his hand to signal the soldiers to put down the muzzles of their guns, fearing that some blind bastard would accidentally fire and kill the Supreme Commander. "Now, let's make a deal," Lawrence said calmly, and now it was his turn to look at Colonel Kino with a teasing face. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49 Evacuation, Part 1. "You. What do you want to do? Put down the knife." Colonel Kino's tone began to panic, and those who didn't know would think that he was surrounded by Lawrence and his men. Lawrence did not reply, but turned back to Lieutenant Seth and ordered, "Bring those prisoners to the front and proceed according to the previous arrangement." Then, more than 100 defenders of Yangjiao Bay were tied up and brought to the front. What made Colonel Kino's forehead sweat even more was that Lawrence directly ordered the soldiers to put the muzzles of their guns on the backs of the heads of these prisoners of war. It seemed that Colonel Kino would watch more than 100 corpses and blood flow into a river in the next second. "You damn lunatic. Didn't your superiors teach you the etiquette of war?" Colonel Kino pointed at Lawrence and shouted tremblingly. Although he cursed, he couldn't help but order the soldiers to retreat a little, so as not to really cause a tragic scene of corpses everywhere. If the more than 100 prisoners of war did not make Colonel Kino so panicked, then General Berlin, who was now held hostage by Lawrence, made Colonel Kino dare not act rashly. "War etiquette?" Lawrence chuckled and said, "The standard of behavior for the victor is war etiquette. Now, would you like to consider the deal I mentioned? What deal do you want?" Colonel Kino wiped his cold sweat and asked in a deep voice, "Let us go, and I will let your people go." This. Colonel Kino gritted his teeth and began to struggle. No matter which side he chose, he couldn't make a good choice. "Sir, we can't let these people go. There are." A Genoese major saw that Colonel Kino was hesitant and hurried forward to whisper in his ear. However, before the major could finish his words, Colonel Kino slapped him in the face in anger and shouted, "You pig. General Belron is in the hands of the other side." After venting his anger, Colonel Kino took a deep breath, barely calmed down, and shouted to Lawrence, "I promise to let you leave safely, but in return, I need to see your sincerity." Lawrence nodded and ordered Lieutenant Seth, "Lieutenant, release half of the prisoners." He was not worried that Colonel Kino would immediately turn against them after accepting half of the prisoners. Both of them knew very well that the more than 100 prisoners present were not as important as General Belron alone. Seeing the released captives running towards their own ranks with a sense of relief, Colonel Kino's face became even gloomier, and he squeezed out a sentence from his teeth. "Sir, you can leave now, but we will always keep a distance of 300 meters from you until you release all the Genoese soldiers." Lawrence nodded in understanding, holding General Berlin hostage while swaggering forward. The Genoese soldiers in front of him gnashed their teeth at Lawrence, but had to make way for him and watched Lawrence walk straight past them. The soldiers of the 4th Battalion looked at each other and hurried to keep up with Lawrence's pace. It was the first time in their lives that they had walked straight through the enemy's encirclement so arrogantly. Even with a sharp blade on his neck, General Berlin remained expressionless. It was not until Lawrence led the soldiers of the 4th Battalion through the encirclement of the Genoese soldiers that he sighed and said, "Lawrence Bonaparte, I have to say, you are despicable, but wise." Lawrence smiled and put the dagger back on his waist, letting General Berlin walk beside him, and responded with a faint smile, "That's great. I heard that only people like this can laugh to the end." General Berlin glanced at Lawrence and whispered, "That's true." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the two troops had marched to the junction of Corsica and the actual control area of Genoa. Seeing this, Lawrence directly released General Berlin and the remaining prisoners of war. He also knew that, if he tried to bring General Berlin back to Bastia, Colonel Kinno would launch an attack no matter what. Even if he killed General Berlin, Colonel Kinno could not let such a supreme commander who knew a lot of confidential intelligence fall into the enemy's base camp. Before leaving, General Berlin looked at Lawrence meaningfully, opened his mouth, and hesitated for a moment, then said, "I have a feeling that maybe in the short second half of my life, I will often hear the name Napoleon Bonaparte. I believe in your feeling." Lawrence smiled and waved goodbye to General Berlin. After releasing the prisoners, Lawrence also ordered everyone to march quickly, to prevent the enemy from pursuing. After receiving the prisoners, however, Major Trifoli was puzzled and asked Lawrence, "Major Bonaparte, aren't we trying to attract the enemy to attack Bastia? Why do we have to get rid of their pursuit now?" Lawrence looked back at General Berlin's back, licked his dry lips and said, "The tactic of playing hard to get is still risky, and even without us as bait, General Berlin will definitely take the initiative to attack Bastia." Major Trifoli still didn't understand after hearing this, and opened his mouth to ask something, but seeing Lawrence's firm and confident expression, he gave up, and chose to believe and obey the order of his superior. At the same time, in the Genoese army, Colonel Kinno saluted General Berlin with a face full of fear, and said carefully, "General, it's great to see you return safely." General Berlin didn't say anything, but simply nodded in return. Read the correct version in 1619 book bar. Seeing General Berlin's unhappy expression, Colonel Kinno hurriedly suggested, "General, should we pursue the enemy immediately? If the Bastia garrison does not respond in time, we have a chance to annihilate these people." "No need." General Berlin waved his hand and suddenly asked about the matter in the Creekwood fortress. "How long will the supplies in the fortress last now?" Colonel Kinno was stunned, not knowing why the general suddenly asked this, but when he thought of the black smoke that had not yet dissipated in the direction of the Horn of Sheep Bay, he understood what General Berlin meant. "General, the supplies in the fortress are only enough for 1 week, and most of the supplies are stored in the Horn of Sheep Bay." "General, could it be that?" Colonel Kinno swallowed his saliva and looked at General Berlin anxiously. "The supplies in the Horn of Sheep Bay only arrived at the beginning of this month, which means that the Genoese army on Corsica Island had no additional supplies throughout February. Even if the mainland was urged to make an extra emergency supply, it would not be able to be properly allocated in a week." General Berlin ignored him, and instead watched the soldiers of the 4th Battalion fleeing at an accelerated pace, muttering absent-mindedly, "So that's what Napoleon Bonaparte did. He deliberately revealed the information about Bastia to me, and directly burned the supplies in the Gulf of Cerro Azul. This leaves me with only one way to go." "What do you mean?" General Kinno asked, puzzled. "Pass my order." General Berlin calmly ordered, "Send a reconnaissance squad to find out the situation in Bastia. In addition, notify the commanders of all 6 battalions to prepare to attack Bastia today." After issuing the order, General Berlin felt a palpitation, and the unpredictable smile of the young Corsican major could not help but appear in his mind. This was a complete conspiracy. General Berlin had realized that every step he took seemed to be controlled by Lawrence, but judging from the current situation, these orders were the best choice at the moment. Attack Bastia to obtain supplies. Is this the move you want me to make? Although the opponent was only a small major, General Berlin unconsciously put Lawrence on the same level as himself. "Napoleon Bonaparte, what on earth are you calculating?" Chapter 50 Evacuation, Part 2. 1768 was the second day after Lawrence led the 4th Battalion to evacuate from the Riverwood Fortress. After returning to Bastia yesterday afternoon, Lawrence and Trifoli also reported the situation to General Nathan as soon as possible. When General Nathan learned that the 4th Battalion had captured the highest commander of the Genoese army in Corsica alive, he was almost shocked. This was what he had dreamed of for so many years in the Northern Army. Unexpectedly, Lawrence led only more than 200 troops to accomplish this feat. Although he was not taken back to Bastia in the end, as long as this matter was spread, it would be enough to make Lawrence and the entire 4th Battalion famous. Not to mention that Lawrence also seized a batch of Genoa's sophisticated equipment. These custom-made equipment from the German region were much better than those made in Corsica, and even General Nathan was a little jealous. Of course, Lawrence did not plan to tell Nathan about General Berlin's notebook for the time being, but was going to hand it over to Governor Paoli after returning to Ajaccio. After all, this is a key item that killed Luo. As for the matter of attracting the Genoese army to attack, which was the most concerned issue for the three of them, Lawrence did not explain too much, but only said that the Genoese army would definitely launch an attack within 2 days. On February 9th, Lawrence and Trifle did not return to the camp of the 4th Battalion, but stayed in General Nathan's longhouse waiting for changes in the battle situation. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a scout hurriedly came to the longhouse to report. Judging from the dust and dirt on his body, he should have just returned from the outpost. General, we have observed that the garrison in the Creekwood fortress has begun to gather, and the target should be Bastia. The scout panted and said anxiously. General Nathan glanced at Lawrence with a complicated expression. He didn't expect that this young man was really so predictable, as if everything was within his calculations. Lawrence also noticed General Nathan's strange look, smiled and looked at him, stood up and said, in this case, I should also return to the 4th Battalion with Major Trifoli to start commanding the evacuation. General Nathan nodded silently, watched Lawrence and Trifoli walk out of the longhouse, sighed, and then called the messenger and said, notify all troops to assemble and prepare to evacuate. Only 1 battalion of troops will be left in Bastia for symbolic resistance. On the evening of February 9th, the Genoese army began to attack Bastia. They encountered almost no resistance. After a burst of sporadic gunfire in the city, General Berlin's troops successfully took over this military stronghold that he had been extremely eager for, and a large area around it. Of course, the residents in these areas had been evacuated to the rear in advance and given corresponding compensation. General Belland. Colonel Kino ran to General Belland with a smile on his face and reported, Bastia is completely under our control. But General Belland did not show any joy. He sighed and asked, how are the supplies in the city? Colonel Kino was stunned for a moment, then he put away his flattering smile and replied bitterly, the Corsicans should have taken everything away when they retreated. There is only enough food in the city for 5 days. It's intentional. General Belland nodded slightly. If the garrison in Bastia retreated in a hurry, it would be impossible to transport all the supplies out in a short time. However, for General Belland, the food in the city plus the supplies in the Riverwood fortress, if the amount of each meal was reduced, it would still be enough to last for half a month, and it would be enough to wait until a batch of supplies were dispatched from Genoa. However, why did the Corsicans give them a city for free? This question has always troubled General Belland. At the same time, the garrison in Bastia was marching southward towards the new station. Their destination was a castle in the south. Similar to the Riverwood fortress, this castle was also built by a noble family in the Middle Ages. However, the Corsican government did not have the money to build and reinforce this castle, and the castle looked like it had been through many vicissitudes of life. The story of the 4th Battalion burning Sheephorn Bay and capturing General Berlin alive a few days ago had long been spread throughout the Northern Legion. General Nathan had to acknowledge their achievements and arrange them with the other 3 infantry battalions when allocating the garrison. Oh my god, those other soldiers of the 4th Battalion. I didn't expect them to be able to return safely after causing such damage behind the Riverwood fortress. And their equipment should not be ordinary standard equipment. Yes, but it should be much better than what we have. I heard that each of them was given a bottle of good wine. Damn, we can't even drink watered down light beer. A correct version in the 16-9 book bar. There's nothing we can do. They won it themselves. When Lawrence led the soldiers to the garrison, he instantly attracted the attention of the soldiers from the other 3 battalions, and the whispering discussions reached Lawrence's ears. Even when the battalion commanders of the other 3 battalions came forward to greet Lawrence, their eyes were very complicated, mixed with admiration and jealousy. When Lawrence first came to the Northern Corps and was assigned to the 4th Battalion, they were still waiting to see Lawrence's joke. In their eyes, Lawrence's military position was entirely due to his flattery of General Pauly, but no one expected that in less than a week, Lawrence would slap them in the face with real achievements. Every soldier in the 4th Battalion also held his head high and accepted these discussions with envy and jealousy. In just a few days, they had gone from being cannon fodder that everyone disliked to the focus of the entire army. And all the soldiers in the 4th Battalion knew in their hearts that all this happened after Napoleon Bonaparte arrived. The glory and wealth that Lawrence promised to the soldiers had been completed by a small part. At least in the Northern Corps, no one would roll their eyes at the soldiers of the 4th Battalion anymore. After settling down in the new garrison, Lawrence did not immediately withdraw and return to Ajaccio, but prepared to stay in the army for a while. First, it was to observe the future movements of the Genoese army. If the Genoese army did not intend to occupy Bastia, Lawrence would have to find a way to pull the front line back. Of course, Lawrence and General Nathan both believed that this possibility was extremely low, and no one would spit out the meat in their mouths. The second was to continue to consolidate his influence in the army. After all, Lawrence was only in the army for about a week, and it was difficult to guarantee that he would still be supported by his soldiers after being away for a long time. Lawrence, who was familiar with history, knew very well that in this turbulent era, especially in a country like Corsica, which was surrounded by big countries and was at risk of being annexed at any time, holding the gun in his hand was definitely the first priority. After the people's hearts, military force, and wealth are all gathered, it will be my turn to lead the Corsicans. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.